Hello, welcome to this stream. Hello, welcome to this video. Yeah, whatever you're watching. Hello, welcome. I'm going to be reading Musui's story. It's about the last samurai, one of the last samurai, Kokichi. It's an autobiography. It's going to be interesting. Let's see what we have inside. I'm not going to be reading the introduction or the appendixes or the translation notes. Just going to do the main prologue here and the story. It's very large margins, as you can tell, so this is a quick read. We've only got about 150-ish pages. Is it? Yeah, 157 pages. So, here we go. Prologue. Confined to my house by the order of my superiors, I spent the past year or so reading all manner of writings, tales of war, records of the house of Tokugawa, and the like. In doing so, it came to my attention that there are innumerable examples of brilliant generals and brave warriors who disregarded the laws of heaven, whether in governing their realms or in dealing with their subordinates, and whether in times of war or of peace. They resorted to tyranny or arbitrary laws and fell into habits of luxury and lechery. And even if they may have been successful for a while, they all eventually lost their dominions. Again, in instances of valorous warriors who fell short of accompanying their aims and came to grief for defying the teachings of the sages are almost too numerous to count. I realized that this was true for both China and Japan. Every one of those who had been brought to ruin or lost their lands had been punished by heaven for neglecting the properties between sovereign and subject, the bond of affection between parent, child, and brother, and for wallowing in greed and extravagance. All the more wondrous, then, that I have survived thus far without mishap. Indeed, I am so overwhelmed by the mercy and goodness of heaven that I even hesitate to show my face to my fellow men. Surely heaven must have blessed me, because even in the midst of my errant ways I helped people out, giving money unstingingly and rescuing them from difficulties. How else is one supposed to account for my present state of comfort and ease? My son, Rintaro, is serious and associates only with friends who are good, and shuns the company of those who may have bad influence. He studies the military arts, is devoted to me, and looks after his sisters. He is frugal and never wasteful, and never too proud to wear simple clothes or eat plain food. He sees to it that I lack nothing. My daughters, too, have taken complete charge of the household and see to it that my wife and I suffer no hardship or inconvenience. My years of retirement have been truly comfortable and pleasant. Supposing my children had turned out to be worthless like me, such comfort and ease as I now enjoy would have been impossible. This, too, is truly wondrous, and leads me to believe that I have yet to be abandoned by the gods. So listen to me, grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Follow the example of my son Rintaro, and act so that your descendants may prosper. From age 8 or 9 and leave all else, and devote yourself. From the age of 8 or 9, leave all else, and devote yourself day and night to your studies and the military arts. Read as many books as you can, better that than some half-baked learning. Girls, from the age of 10, learn how to arrange men's hair in proper samurai style, and to fix your own hair as well. Take up sewing. From about 13, do things for yourself and learn to read and write as well as the average person. For then, even after you are married, you will have no trouble managing your household. My eldest daughter has never had to ask others for help from the time she was 14. On the contrary, the rest of the family looks to her. Boys, aim to be strong and the sturdy of body. Eat simple food and work at mastering the military arts. If possible, strive to excel in at least one art. Serve your master, the shogun, with utmost loyalty, and your parents with filial devotion. Treat your wife and children with benevolence, and your servants with compassion. Be conscientious about your job. Associate with friends in truth and sincerity. Be ever thrifty, eschew luxury, and wear simple clothes. Cultivate relations with those who are upright, and seek their advance in following the path of righteousness. In choosing teachers, select those who are virtuous and without pretense, even if they are not of the first rank in their professions. Do not consort with useless friends. Be discreet in your conversation. Respect your superiors. Keep things to yourself. Venerate your ancestors, and take care that no sacrilege is committed. Arrive at your place of work 1 hour early. Study the literary and military arts as though you were cultivating a field. In your youth, fill every hour with the pursuit of various branches of learning. Spare time only invites the devil to work his mischief, and the so-called polite accomplishments. Avoid the so-called polite accomplishments. A moderate amount in old age is permissible, but if carried to excess, you'll turn out like me. Rather than planting shrubs in the garden, raise crops. Only then will you fully understand the lot of the peasant. Strive to know the workings of the human heart. Ponder your findings and keep them to yourself as guides to conduct. When instructing students in an art, treat them with sympathy and sincerity, and be especially patient and painstaking with those who are not to your liking. Never show favoritism. In approaching all things with earnestness, you are following the path of heaven and ensuring that happiness of your descendants. If you regard whatever you do as a duty, you should not find it hard to bear. Above all, abstain from greed. Do not entertain it even in your dreams. I was guilty of this, and look what's become of me. Take me as a warning. Set aside possessions in accordance with your stipend. Should a friend or kinsman face an unexpected calamity, be generous in extending help. In arranging marriages for your children, do not make alliances with those above you in social station. As much as possible, choose from a poor family. If one aims too high socially, one soon becomes arrogant. In hiring retainers, too, choose sons from poor families. And when they have completed their terms of service, see to it that they are given appropriate status and rank. Do not give yourself up to carnal pleasures. Watch out for women. A moment's incaution can wreck family and home. Do not remiss in discharging your social and moral obligations. Make peace among your friends in private. Go about your household affairs with moderation and gentleness, and you will never lose your authority as master of the house. Aspire to the paths of the sages, and adhering to their teachings in all things. You will avert grief and misfortune, and be assured of a peaceful and tranquil life. I myself have resolved to follow the path of righteousness henceforth. More than anything, devote yourself to learning and act in accordance with the teachings of the past. With a suitable amount of exertion, there is nothing one cannot achieve. In fact, you will find that once you've worked at something long enough, the rest will be easy. Never stray from the path of reason. It is important to make something of oneself, gain honor and fame, and bring prosperity to one's family. Look at me, for instance. Forsaking reason and common sense, I wasted my time in activities unworthy of a human being. Not once did I hold office, and because of me, the house of Katsu, which had served the shogun honorably for generations, was disgraced. A more telling example you'll never find. True, I've finally come to my senses, but no amount of regret is going to do much good. I am regarded by my fellow men as a ne'er-do-well, and when I send someone over to retrieve any articles I might have lent, people say, "Why should we?" when old Katsu got the goods dishonestly in the first place. The same goes for money I have lent. Some people have such low opinion of me that they don't even have the courtesy to answer my requests. And come to think of it, they're probably right. In such cases, too, one should not bear a grudge. Just blame yourself for whatever has happened. Render an act of kindness to your sworn enemy, and there will be no cause for trouble. As for myself, I'll admit I was resentful when I put those under house arrest by my commissioner. But then I thought the matter over carefully and realized that I'd been the one who'd started the fire, so to speak. So now, in atonement for my sins, I recite the Lotus Sutras every evening, and secretly pray for the success of those I misjudged at spiting me. Perhaps because of this my health has improved markedly of late. Nothing untoward has occurred in my family, not a harsh word exchanged. Each day is passed in pleasant laughter. I find it truly curious, and it is to pass on this piece of wisdom to my descendants that I decided to take upon my writing brush from time to time. Carefully bear in mind the fruits of good and evil. With what awe and gratitude should we recall the debt we owe Lord Tokugawa Ieyasu, who suffered such tribulations during his childhood and endured long years of warfare. To him do we owe our present age of peace, the absence of all worries of thirst or hunger, and the comforts of family and home. We would also do well to remember the hardships of our ancestors. For us, their descendants, to tuck our hands in our kimono sleeves and to live off the stipends we inherited, to forget the past and indulge in extravagant foods and clothes, or worse yet, not even serve in a government post. is surely to fail in loyalty to our masters and filial piety to our parents. Filial piety to our parents. Ponder on this. Nowadays, people do their work seated on the tatami without the least anxiety. And the very worst, someone may stumble and fall down. At the very worst, someone may stumble and fall down. The least one can do is rise early, get to work, sleep at night without any cares, eat light and simple meals, forego luxuries, and pursue the path of righteousness. Regard it as sufficient if your everyday clothes are not tattered. Regard it as sufficient if your clothes for office are not soiled. Likewise, regard it as sufficient if your roof does not leak or the tatami on the floor is not worn through. Be frugal at all times, attend to household affairs, and consort with your colleagues in a manner appropriate to your station in life. Thrift is all to the good, but do not be stingy. Just remember the meaning of the two Chinese ideographs, frugal and misery. In reading books, too, if your attitude is wrong, you will end up as some good-for-nothings dictionary or bookcase. The same is true of the military arts. If you go about your training as if it's an exercise in brutish strength, your limbs will become muscle-bound, and you will be about as much use as someone's sword rack. Take these words to heart. The same rule applies to becoming a real human being. If you succumb to avarice, you may appear human on the surface, but inside you are a cat or dog. Your first concern should be to strive for true humanity. If you do not pursue learning and the military arts with the correct attitude, you will become a cripple and misfit and might as well not study at all. Remember well how important it is to have the proper spirit. Children and grandchildren, heed my advice. As I have said, I am altogether ignorant when it comes to writing difficult characters, and have made many errors in setting down this record. Read it nevertheless with great thought and care. Early Winter, the 14th year of Tenpo, written at Uguisandi, 1843. Childhood, Kyowa, second year. This is 1802. There can't be many in the world as foolish as I am, so let me say this to my grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Listen to what I have to say, and may the scoundrels and fools especially take my story as a lesson. I was the child of my father's concubine. She fell out of favor with him, and I was born in her family home. I was then taken by my father's wife, I think of her as my real mother, and put under the care of a wet nurse. I was naughty from time to time, and I was little and made life difficult for my mother, and with my father away at his office every day, I acted up and was so headstrong that all were at their wits' end. Or so our old retainer Riheiji told me years later. We lived in the Aburahori section of Fukugawa. In the garden there was an ornamental pond that was filled with water drawn from one of the nearby canals. During the summer, I would swim in it every day. I knew that my father returned from work around 2 p.m, so just before he came back, I would get out of the water and amuse myself with something else, looking the picture of innocence. My father would ask Riheiji why the water pond was always so muddy. Old Riheiji said that he had never quite known what to say. My mother suffered from palsy and had trouble getting around. The rest of the household was also female. I looked down on all of them and spent my days getting into one kind of mischief or another. My older brother Hikoshiro also already lived in his own house and had no idea what was going on. When I was 5, I took part in a kite fight against Chokichi, the son of a laborer in Maicho. Chokichi, who was also older by about 3 years, seized my kite, smashed it, and took away the string. I picked up a jagged rock, and grabbing hold of the collar of his kimono, hit him in the face. Blood came spurting out of his mangled lips, and Chokichi began bawling. My father happened to see this from over the garden fence. He sent one of his men to fetch me home. "What do you mean," he said angrily, "hurting someone's child like that? You can't be left unpunished." He tied me to one of the posts in the veranda and whacked me on the head with a wooden clog. To this day I have a bald spot and a dent where he struck me. The razor gets caught and nicks the skin whenever I have my head shaved, and each time I'm reminded of that Chokichi. My mother would put away the sweets and cakes that people gave us. I would steal them, so she took to hiding them here and there. Sooner or later I'd find them anyways, but she could never bring herself to report it to my father. In fact, since she had been the one who decided to take me in, she covered up for me all the time. And as for the servants and retainers in the house, there were too many in awe of her to say a word to my father. I grew up a real hellraiser. One year on Boys' Day in the 5th month, sheaves of irises had been hung up under the eaves, as was the custom. I kept stealing them so I could play a game of slap the iris leaves with my friends. At first, Riheiji said nothing, but by the 5th time it had happened, his patience ran out. Enough is enough, he complained to my father. Look, my father replied, children are supposed to be full of spirit. Otherwise they become sickly and have to see the doctor. Just buy plenty of irises and keep hanging them up. And a lot of it was a bother too, Riheiji sighed after he told me this story when I was 16 or 17. Old Riheiji worked for us for many years, even going all the way to Shinano province to accompany Hikoshiro, who had been appointed the administrator of the shogunal district. The retainers took my brother with him. All at the time were of non-samurai rank. They were each given money to buy samurai status when they returned to Edo 5 years later. Riheiji alone decided to retire and take his share of the money, went to live with a relative. He was cheated of every penny by this man and obliged to come back to my brother's house. There, he was regarded by the other retainers as a nuisance. I felt sorry for Riheiji, and after arranging for him to become a lay priest, I sent him off on a pilgrimage around the country. It didn't last long, and I next set him up as a caretaker at the Kannoji temple in Yanaka. He died shortly after, but all this took place years later, when I was about 30. I was adopted by the Katsu family when I was 7. My age was officially given as 17. I was adopted by the Katsu family when I was 7. My age was officially given as 17, and the hair at the front of my head was cut accordingly. As part of the adoption procedure, Ishikawa Ukon no Shogen, the commissioner of my unit at the Kobunshin Gumi, and his assistant, Obi Daishichiro, came to the house. How old are you, and what is your name? Ishikawa asked. My name is Kokichi, and I am 17. Ishikawa pretended to be taken aback. Well, for 17, you certainly look old, he burst out laughing. My adopted father's brother, Aoki Jinpei, who served at Edo Castle as a member of the Great Guard, acted as sponsor. Until then, I had been called Kamematsu. With my adoption name, my name was changed to Kokichi. My adopted parents had already died, leaving behind a daughter and her grandmother. It was decided that the two would live at my father's place in Tokugawa. I was completely ignorant of these arrangements and spent my time in play. I got into another fight over a kite, again with some boys from Maicho. There must have been 20 or 30, and I took them on alone, hitting and punching, but they finally got the better of me. I was cornered on a large rock in an open field and struck over and over with bamboo poles. My hair had fallen loose all over my face, and I was sobbing. I took out my short sword. I slashed left and right. But I knew I was beaten and decided then and there to commit harakiri. I stripped to the waist and sat down on the rock. As it so happened, a rice dealer by the name of Shirokoya was standing nearby. He talked me into giving up the idea and took me home. After this, though, all the boys in the neighborhood became my followers. I was 7 at the time. Our house in Fukugawa was close to the sea and was flooded from time to time. My father received permission to move to Honjo. Until the new house was ready, we rented the residence of someone called Wakabayashi in Surugadai, on the other side of the Otahime Inari shrine. The house was enormous, with an imposing garden, and next to it, in a field of at least The house was enormous, with an imposing garden, and next to it, a field at least a third of an acre. Everyone said it was haunted. One evening, it must have been 8 or so, my father called together the entire household and ordered us to tell each other ghost stories in the dark. He said we were to put up a straw doll in the adjoining field, and after the last story had been told, we were to go one by one and tie a piece of paper with our name to the sleeve of the doll's kimono. It was funny to see everyone so scared. I was supposed to go last and stick a polished copper coin in the center of the doll's face, just like an eye. By the time my turn came, it was past midnight and pitch black. I had to grope around for a while, but I did it, and everyone praised me. My grandmother, by adoption, had been known for her mean disposition from the time she was a young girl. It was said that she drove both of my adoptive parents to an early death. She was nasty to me, too, and nagged and scolded day after day. I would lose my temper and fight back with every insult I could think of. My father overheard me one day and called me over. "So, who do you think you are, talking like that to your grandmother at your age? No telling what you'll do in the future." He bared his dagger and came at me. His wife, Kyo, apologized for me in the nick of time. The following year, we moved to the new house in Kamezawa-cho, Honjo. For the time being, I was settled together with my grandmother in the rooms toward the front of the house. She could now scold me all she wanted, and if that wasn't bad enough, she served up the most awful meals. How I hated her. I spent most of my time away from home and got into one scrape after another. One day, my pet dog got into a vicious fight with a dog that belonged to someone in Kamezawa-cho. With me at the time were Anzai Yojiro. He was 14 and the leader of our gang. Kurobe Kintaro, Kurobe Kenkichi, Shinoki Daijiro, Aoki Shimenosuke, Takahama Hikosaburo, and my younger brother, Tessaku. The 8 of us started beating up the dog's owner and his friends in front of my house. The boys from Kamezawa-cho sent for help, and pretty soon 40 or 50 kids, all armed with bamboo spears, showed up from Midori-cho. We got a hold of wooden swords and poles and managed to drive them away. They soon returned for another attack with several grown-ups as reinforcement. We put up a good fight, but when it became clear that we were losing, we withdrew behind the front gates of our neighbors, the Tokugawa family. Scarcely had we caught our breath when the other side, flushed with victory, began ramming the gate with a log. Desperate, we decided to use our blunt-edged swords. We flung open the gate, charged at the boys, and sent them flying away. We ran after them, waving our swords. My younger brother, just 7 but a real fighter, was ahead up in front of Benji, a tailor's son from Maicho. Turned back and jabbed him in the chest with a bamboo spear. I rushed up to Benji to strike and struck him in the forehead with my sword. That good-for-nothing Benji flopped on his rear and landed right in a ditch. So for good measure, I gave him a few more blows to the face. The fathers of some of the Maicho boys came running to the scene. What an uproar. The 8 of us let out a hearty cheer. We then returned to the Tokugawa residence and congratulated one another. My father, who had been watching all this from one of the rooms flanking the front gate, was very angry. He confined me to my room and ordered me to stay out of sight for the next 30 days. Tessaku was locked up in the storehouse for 5 or 6 days. When I was 9, my father told me to take judo lessons with Suzuki Seibei, a relative of the Katsu family, and Yoko Amicho. Suzuki served as the head of the Office of Procurements and was reputed to have many students, among them daimyo from provincial domains and from the great houses of Hitotsubashi and Tayasu. The classes I attended were held on the 3rd, 5th, 8th, and 10th days of each month. I behaved myself at first, but soon got into mischief. My fellow students strongly disliked me and ganged up against me all the time. On my way to class one day, I found to my great surprise that a crowd of boys from Maicho and their parents were lying in wait for me near the Hanoki riding ground. "Here comes that troublemaker, Otani. Let's beat him to a pulp," they yelled, flourishing their bamboo spears and sticks. They quickly closed in on me. I drew my sword, slashed my way out, and clambered up the embankment of the riding ground. Just below was a muddy ditch that surrounded the shogunate lumberyard. I jumped in, I splattered my haori and hakama, but at least I had escaped. The gatekeeper of the lumberyard was a friend of mine. I often went there to play, and knowing he was a brave man, I had him walk me home. 40 or 50 people were still waiting. Did we get a thrashing? For 2 months I avoided that section of Kamezawa-cho. Then one day I caught Tatsu and the son of an embroidery craftsman in Kamezawa-cho, walking by our house. I ran out and struck him with my sword until one of our retainers had to come out and restrain me. He told me later that he had taken Tatsu home and explained to his parents that I was only trying to get even for what had happened near the riding ground. In any case, no one in Kamezawa-cho crossed me after that. As I said, everyone in judo class hated me. On the day that all night on the day that an all-night midwinter session was to be held, we received permission from the teacher to bring food. We took a break until midnight. I had packed a lacquer box full of bean jam cakes and had been looking forward all day to this moment when we would get to share the food. My classmates had other plans. They got together and tied me up with an obi, hoisted me to one of the rafters and began eating, and even helping themselves to my cakes. So I pissed on their heads, spraying the food that had been spread out, and naturally everything had to be thrown away. Served them right, too. I was 10. In the summer, I began riding lessons with Ishiki Ikojiro, a guard at the Edo Castle who lived in Kikugawa-cho in Fukugawa. Lessons were held at the riding grounds at the Iodonobashi residence of Jinbo Isosaburo, a samurai with a stipend of 6,000 koku. I liked riding and rode around the ground day after day. After about a month, I decided to go out beyond the gates, but once on the street, who did I run into but my teacher? I quickly turned into a side alley. At the next lesson, he gave me a scolding. Why don't you even know how to ride in a saddle properly? You will desist from leaving the ground for the time being. I switched to another teacher, Okubo Kanjiro, and learned how to handle a horse. My new teacher was excellent, telling me, among other things, to practice daily on a wooden horse. He also said I should ride on a saddle horse 50 times a month. I had the stable boy rent horses from Tosuke, Denzo, and Ichigoro, and spent all my time riding. In the end, I got a horse of my own and kept it at Tosuke's stable. I was fascinated by fires and rushed to see one whenever I could. Whenever I heard a fire had broken out in Bakuro-cho and dashed over on my... One day I had heard a fire broken out in Bakuro-cho and dashed over on my horse. I was scolded sharply by a courier named Imai Tatewaki and chased all the way to the residence of the Tsugaru domain in Honjo. My horse was too fast for him, though, and I was finally able to throw him off. I learned afterward that you're not supposed to go within 300 yards of a fire. On another occasion, I borrowed a horse from Denzo and galloped full speed on the embankment of the Sumida River. For some reason, a strap suddenly broke and one stirrup fell into the river. I had to go all the way back with only the other. When I was 11, I became a student of Udono Jinzaemon, a swordmaster in Surugadai. I had first heard about him from my friends, who said that he was a master of the Chuya-ryu and Ito-ryu schools of fencing, and retained by one of the Tokugawa consorts. I liked the fact that Udono exclusively taught me the technique for the wooden sword, and I practiced diligently. Before long, I was initiated into a technique called the So. The son of Ishikawa, Ukon no Shogun, my commissioner at the Kobushingumi, was also in my class. He knew all about me, how much my stipend was and so forth, and taunted me in front of the other students at every opportunity. Katsu, what's your stipend? A measly 40 bales of rice? Since he was the commissioner's son, I kept quiet. He continued to make fun of me, so one day I hit him good and hard with my wooden sword, cursed him out, and left him blubbering. I received a terrible scolding from the teacher. That so-and-so now goes by the name of Ishikawa Tarozaemon, and holds the post of captain of the foot soldiers. An old fogey and stupid just like a woman, he'll never amount to much. When I was 12, my brother Hikoshiro arranged for me to begin school. He took me to the Shogunate Academy in Yushima. I began the studying of Chinese classic, the greater learning, with Hoki Minokichi and Sano Gunzaemon, officials in charge of the school dormitory. I hated studying and every day slipped out through the fence and into the Sakura riding ground, where I spent hours writing. At most, I learned to read 5 or 6 pages of the greater learning. The 2 teachers soon sent word that they didn't want me, which suited me just fine. I did nothing but ride, and with all my money gone, I began stealing from my mother's pin money and the cash she had set aside for emergencies. My brother was away in Shinano at the time on a 5-year assignment as district administrator. In the 3rd year, he came back to Edo for an audience with the shogun. When he heard that I was spending all my time and money on writing, he ordered me to give up lessons and sent a letter to my teacher giving notice. He also scolded me severely and told me to stay at home. For a while, I couldn't leave the house, and what a pain that was. Following autumn, I was 13. Hikoshiro returned to Shinano, and I was once more free to roam and loaf about as I liked. My grandmother was as mean as ever. She only had to see my face and would start berating me about this or that. In desperation, I went to my brother's wife for advice. She took pity on me and promised to speak to my father. One day he said to my grandmother, "Kokichi is growing up. With this low stipend, if he doesn't know how to cook, he won't be able to manage in the future. From now on, why don't you let him cook for himself?" My grandmother took this as an excuse to do absolutely nothing for me and left me to prepare all my meals. At the same time, she kept thinking up ways to make my life as wretched as possible. Once I found out that she had even diluted my soy sauce with water. If anyone gave us cakes or other delicacies, she would hide them and give me none. But if she so much as sewed a kimono for me, she would announce it to the whole world, telling everyone in the same breath what an ungrateful child that I was. She made me furious. Worse still, I couldn't complain to my father, since he would only rebuke me. I can't remember ever having been so miserable. Chapter 2. I Run Away. This is approximately 1815. I was 14. I'd made up my mind to run away to the Kyoto area and stay there for the rest of my life. After all, I thought, no matter what a man puts his hand to, he'll always be able to eat. On the 28th day of the 5th month, I put on my pair of trousers over my kimono and set off. I didn't know a thing about the world, and as for money, I only had about 7 or 8 gold ryo I had stolen and tucked in the band I wrapped around my stomach. Asking directions along the way, I got as far as Shinagawa. I was lonely and frightened, but I pressed on and stayed the night at an inn in Fujisawa. The next morning, I woke up early and walked about aimlessly, wondering what to do. 2 tradesmen caught up with me. "Where are you heading?" they asked. "Nowhere in particular," I said. "Maybe someplace near Kyoto." "Come along with us. We're going that way too." Taking heart, I went with them to Odawara. That night at the inn, they said, "Tomorrow we'll be passing through the barrier station at Hakone. Have you got a travel permit?" I'd never heard of such a thing. "Give us 200 coppers and we'll get one for you." I did as they said and was let through the barrier station the next day. All along, I remained on my guard, but by the time we stopped at the Hamamatsu for the night, I felt I could trust them since they'd taken such good care of me. Before going to sleep, I took off all my clothes. In the morning when I woke up and looked by my pillow, I saw that everything was gone. During the night, they had stolen my kimono, my pair of swords, and the stomach band containing my money. I was stunned. I asked the innkeeper if he had seen the 2 men. He said, "Oh, they were going on ahead to be in time for the festival at Tsushima Shrine in Owari, and that you were going to catch up." Completely overcome, I burst into tears. The kind innkeeper tried to console me. "You know what they were? Flies on sesame seeds. Thieves that prey on travelers. And here I thought they were your companions from Edo. What a shame. Where will you go now?" "I'm not sure. I was thinking of going somewhere near Kyoto." "Yes, but what can you do with only an underrobe to your name?" The innkeeper was at a loss too, but then he disappeared for a minute and returned with a big ladle. "Well," he said, "you're not the only one from Edo who's been robbed on this road. Here, take this and go to the neighborhood of Hamamatsu Castle and the countryside beyond, and you'll see if you can't beg for a coin or 2. I got up my courage and spent the whole day begging. By evening, I received about a peck of rice and wheat and about 120 or 130 copper pennies. The innkeeper was a good-hearted man and put me up for the night. The following day, he said, it might not be a bad idea if you first went to the Ise shrine and prayed for your well-being. I gave him half a grain and 50 coppers as a token of my gratitude and headed for Ise. During the day, I begged for alms, and after dark I sought shelter in pine groves, on river banks, and in roadside shrines. Swarms of mosquitoes prevented me from sleeping, and believe me, that was no fun. At Aioinosuka in Ise, I became friends with another young beggar. He gave me some advice. Go to a priest named Ryudayu and tell him that you've taken time off from the greengrocer Osaka, and tell him that you've taken time off from the greengrocer Osakaya in Shinagawa to pay your respects at Ise. Explain your situation to him and ask him to put you up for a few days. He'll check his records and let you stay. I went straight to Ryudayu's residence and delivered a little speech to an attendant at the inner entrance. A man wearing a hakama came out. He had a ledger with him, and was after looking at it several times, he mentioned me to step inside. I entered with a beating heart and sat down as the man told in a small waiting room. Before long, the man in the hakama came back, and it's a giant picture. And told me to take a bath. It had been some time since I had last bathed. After my bath, the same man brought out an assortment of delicious-looking food. He said, "I'm afraid it's rather simple. I haven't eaten for several days, so I stuffed myself until I was ready to burst. By and by, the priest Ryudayu himself appeared. He was dressed in ceremonial robes. How admirable of you to have come all the way from Edo to make this pilgrimage," he said. "I will present you with an amulet tomorrow." I kept nodding. "Oh yes, yes indeed." He brought out a set of quilts and a mosquito net and bid me good night. I slept in great comfort. The next morning I ate another delicious meal and was given the amulet. It then occurred to me that I might as well try to borrow some money in case an emergency arose. I spoke to the attendant, and in a few minutes the man in the hakama came out. "What can I do for you?" he asked. I told him how I had been robbed of everything and said, "I wonder if I could have a loan about 2 ryo for the road." He said he would talk to Ryudayu and withdrew. He returned in a while, and handing me a string of 1,000 coppers, he said, "As you may have noticed, there are many pilgrimages staying here with Ryudayu, and he has little money to spare. This isn't very much, but please take it." I took the money and made a hasty exit. I visited shrines all along the road and filled my belly with all sorts of good food. Very soon I was no better off than I'd been before, or as they say, the same old mokuami. The beggar who had told me about Ryudayu was the son of a papermaker named Murata and came from Kuromon-cho in the Kaneda section of Edo. Heading back to Edo, I begged along the road and finally arrived empty-handed at Fuchu in the province of Suruga. Just think, I wore only an underrobe with a rope for a sash and didn't even have a pair of straw sandals. A fine figure of a beggar I must have been. On the post station in Fuchu, there was a small shrine dedicated to Kannon and some other deity. I crawled under the open porch and slept there every night. One night I slept by a pile of big rocks just inside the entrance to a riding ground near Fuchu Castle. The riding ground bordered on a bamboo grove, and beyond that stood a temple with the shogun's crest on its main gate. Early in the morning I was awakened by 14 or 15 samurai who had come to practice riding. They galloped around with an air of fierce determination, but I could tell right away that none of them was any good. As I got up, a couple of the stable boys spotted me and began shouting, "Look, a beggar boy, the nerve of him, sleeping here. What made you think you could come inside?" I stumbled some excuses and stayed where I was, squatting on my heels, but the men were so hopelessly clumsy that I couldn't help laughing out aloud. The stable boys were indignant. They set on me with their fists, and after knocking me down, dragged me out of the riding ground. I protested at the top of my voice. What's so wrong with telling people they're no good when they're really no good? A samurai who was about 40 came over. "Hey, you beggar boy," he said. "How does a kid like you criticize samurai for the way they ride? Where are you from anyway? Come on, speak up." "I'm from Edo, and I'll have you know I wasn't always a beggar." "Do you like horses?" "Yes." "Let's see you ride then." Clad only in my underrobe, I showed them a thing or two about riding. Everyone was impressed and said to one another, "This wretch must be the son of a samurai." The samurai who had spoken to me earlier said, "Come home with me and I'll give you a meal." So after the practice ended, I followed him to his home. I was on the side street near the residence of the Fuchu town magistrate. We entered through a simple gate and went round the kitchen door. He told me to wait and soon came out with a tray piled high with rice and soup. It was delicious. The samurai had his own meal in a room further inside. He came to the kitchen afterward and asked my name and who my parents were. When I put him off with some lies, he said, "I really feel sorry for you. Stay with us." He gave me a kimono and had his wife arrange my hair and fill a bucket with hot water for me to wash up with. The two just couldn't do enough for me. In a while, the samurai went off somewhere very proper, dressed in a kataginu and hakama. He came back late in the evening. Now that I think it over, I realize he was probably a senior policeman in the service at the town magistrate. That night he called me into the living room and questioned me once more about my background. I lied again. My family? They're tradesmen. In that case, why not live here? I'll see to it that you get a pair of swords and a hakama right away. I stayed for 6 or 7 days, and the entire time this samurai and his wife looked after me, as though I were their own child. I had different plans, however. What good was it making do in a house like this when I could just as well go to Kyoto and become a retainer in some nobleman's house? One evening I changed into my old underrobe, and after folding my kimono and obi neatly by the quilts, I slipped out of the house. I spent the night in a roadside shrine on the other side of the Abe River, got up before sunrise, and ran as fast as I could toward Kyoto. With no money and no food, I was in an awful fix for 3 days. I begged a coin here and there and slept 2 nights in a Jinzo shrine in Utsunomiya. It was around 8 on the second night that I was awakened by a crash somewhere in the vicinity of the shrine veranda. Thinking that another man might be out there, I cleared my throat, as a voice called back, "Who's there?" "A pilgrim on the road to Ise." "Good. I was planning to go to the next post station to gamble. Carry my money for me, and I'll give you something to donate to Ise." I got up and followed the man to a shed somewhere, near the entrance of the post station of Mariko. Inside, 30 or so men were seated in a circle. One of them, he seemed to be the boss, looked at me and demanded, "What's this dirty beggar doing in here?" The man who had brought me said, "The boy said he was on his way to Ise, so I decided to bring him along. "All right, then. Here, have something to eat and wait around. I'll give you an offering for Ise later on." The boss treated me with food and sake. After they had gambled for a while, the man I'd come up with handed me 300 copper pennies wrapped in a piece of paper. The other gamblers also gave me money, 50, 100, 24, 12, altogether about 900 pennies. "Now go back quickly to the Jizo shrine and sleep for the night," they said. I thanked them, and just as I was about to leave the shed, one of the men called me over and gave me 3 big rice balls. Overjoyed, I ran all the way back to the shrine and made an offering to the Jizo and went to sleep. I wandered for several days begging, and at Yokaichi bumped into Murata, the beggar who had told me about Ryudayu. I thanked him for his kind advice and gave him 100 copper pennies. He seemed very pleased and said, "I've had a decent meal for days. Let's go get something to eat." We bought food and shared it and stretched out on the floor of a pine grove. We talked of all that had happened since we'd last seen each other and spent the night side by side on a bed of pine needles. You've got to admit, the friendship between beggars is something special. My friend and I made another trip to Ise. He said that he wanted to go on to Konpira Shrine in Shikoku. We parted at the town of Yamada. I drifted around in Ise for some 10 days and headed back for Yokaichi. One night, I slept in a pine grove at Shiroko and came down with a high fever and was a splitting headache. I spent the next day in a delirium. It was a couple of days before I finally came to. I managed to make my way to the main road and get several coins from passerby, but I collapsed once again and barely survived on water for the next 7 days. Not too far from the pine grove was a secluded temple. The priest discovered me and brought a bowl of wheat gruel each day. I slowly regained my strength. The priest also gave me 2 straw pallets, one to use as a mattress and the other as a cover. 22 or 23 days must have gone by. To my great joy, I found that I was strong enough to stand up. I made a pair of crutches from a bamboo switch and hobbled around. Within 2 or 3 days, I was able to go back to the temple and thank the priest. He gave me an old sedge hat and a pair of straw sandals and told me to take good care of myself. Then, as I was going out the front gate, he called me back and pressed a string of 100 copper pennies into my hand. I limped along, covering at most 2 miles a day. Pilgrims on the road to Ise were never given food that was cooked, so I had to get by crunching on grains of raw rice. With my stomach in still poor condition, I was soon ill again. I crept into a big hole under a bridge, I can't remember where. I slept for 5 or 6 days. One evening, 2 young beggars approached me. "That hole you're sleeping in, someone from Kondo was using just until last month. And now that he's gone, it's ours. Just because we were away for a couple of days, it doesn't mean you can have it." I explained to them I was sick. "All 3 of us can sleep in it then," they said. We shared the hole for 6 or 7 days. I was short on food, though, and asked the 2 beggars what I should do. They said, "You won't get anything cooked around here. It's against the regulations of Ise Shrine. Why don't you go to a village farther off?" I followed their advice and hobbled on my crutches for over a mile. On the outskirts of a village, a man carrying a long stick stood guard. "You're not allowed in here," he shouted. "Can't you see the sign over there? Get out, you scum." He started to beat me with the stick, and still weak from hunger and sickness, I fainted on the spot. When I recovered consciousness, I found that the guard had kicked me out of the village precincts. It was all I could do to drag myself back to the hole under the bridge. My two beggar friends took only one look at me and wanted to know what happened. I told them about the village guard. "Do you have any rice?" they asked. I brought out the over 3 or 4 cups of rice and wheat I had saved up. "All right, we'll cook some gruel for you." They brought out a chipped sake bottle and filled it with some water and a handful of grains. They next dug a hole in the embankment, and after building a small fire with some twigs, they set the bottle over the flame to simmer. I swallowed a mouthful or two and gave the rest to the 2 beggars. Later, I found an old sake bottle for my own use and cooked whatever grains I could get. It was a big improvement over my previous diet. Feeling much stronger, I stumbled onto Fuchu. I didn't have any money, but luckily it was the season of the Bon Festival of the Dead. Every night I made the rounds of the town. One evening, in a section called Denmacho, I saw a rice dealer had set out a row of small plates of ground grains as alms. I helped myself to one, and noticing another plate with a copper penny, I furtively reached out for that one too. A man who was pounding rice in the shop saw me. "How dare you take 2 plates, he bellowed, and beat me with his fists until I fell unconscious to the ground. I don't know how long I lay there, but I finally came to and limped to a nearby roadside shrine to spend the night. It had been bad enough trying to get around on crutches, but now it hurt even more to move. I spent the next day inside the shrine. Several days passed. I was very hungry. One evening I went to Nichio Machi, but all I could get was rice and wheat grains. I continued walking until I found myself in front of a brothel that stood on a street corner. Inside, a customer was carrying on merrily. He poked his head out and cried, "Say there, anything the matter? Hopping around on crutches at your age? Are you sick?" "I'm afraid I am, sir." "Just as I thought. A good thing you didn't die. Wait, I'll get you something to eat." He had some boiled rice, fish, and other tidbits wrapped in bamboo sheath, and handed me the food, with 300 copper pennies. A sinner who had come face to face with the Buddha himself in hell couldn't have been happier. I threw myself on the ground and thanked him over and over. The customer speculated about me with the prostitutes. From the way he talks, I'd say he comes from Edo, and I'll bet he wasn't always a beggar. From a samurai family, I would guess. Then, to my happiness, he gave me a white cotton kimono decorated at the sleeves with red crepe and a loincloth made of dark blue crepe. He said, "Now go to a cheap inn, get a good night's rest on the tatami." I thanked him again and went straight to the inn on a side street in Denmacho. I begged in the streets of Fuchu during the day and at night returned to the inn. Expenses for food and lodging kept mounting, however, and soon I had to pawn the kimono for 600 copper pennies. I paid the bill at the inn and, clutching the remaining change, left in a hurry for Kyoto. One day I was lying down by the side of a tea house on the outskirts of Ishibe when a group of porters carrying chests for the daimyo of Akizuki stopped for a break. 2 of the porters came to the tea house and sat down for some sake. One of them said to me, "I can tell when you've been sick. Where are you going, by the way?" "Somewhere near Kyoto." "Anywhere in particular?" "Not really." "Forget it then. You don't want to go there. Better to go back to Edo. I'll take you, but you'll have to get your hair done up with proper samurai style." The porter took me to a hairdresser close by. After my head had been shaved and my hair combed into a top knot, he looked me over. "It won't do to have you in those rags," he said, and gave me a clean cotton kimono and a small cotton hand towel. "And we certainly won't get very far with you limping on crutches like that. We'll have to put you on a palanquin." He hired a palanquin and looked after me every day. I had been told that I'd be taken all the way to my home in Edo, but the night we arrived in Fuchu, the porters got into a big brawl about gambling, and the porter who'd been so kind to me decided to return to Kyushu. He took back the kimono and gave me an old cotton underrobe instead, and departed immediately. The other porter, his friend, felt sorry for me and said, "Consider yourself lucky to have come this far. From tomorrow you'll have to make it on your own." He gave me 50 copper pennies. I had little choice but to beg again. I wandered listlessly for days. One night, I'd forgotten where, I'd lay down on a cliff and somehow fell off the edge in my sleep. I must have passed out too. When I regained consciousness the next morning, I realized that I had hit my testicles against a sharp rock. It was too painful to continue walking. I got better little by little, and by the third day I was able to walk about gingerly. By the time I reached Hakone, however, my testicles had become so swollen and were beginning to ooze pus. Gritting my teeth, I pushed on and arrived at Mount Futago late the next day. I fell asleep exhausted. Toward dawn, a mail courier came by. "Did you spend the night here?" he asked. "Yes." "You've got guts then. You could have been eaten by wolves. From now on, you'd better not sleep in the mountains." He tossed me a string of pennies and took off. I crossed Sanmaibashi Bridge and settled down to Sanmaibashi Bridge. I crossed Sanmaibashi Bridge and settled down to nap by the side of a tea house. 5 or 6 coolies came up to me. "Hey kid, why are you laying down here?" one of them asked. "I'm lying down because I'm too hungry to do anything else," I said. The coolies brought me a lot of food, and as I was eating, one of them looked about 40, said, "Come to my house and work as a servant. I'll see to it that you get plenty to eat." I accepted his offer and went home with him. The coolie's name was Kiheiji, and his house was on a side street near Odawara Castle, in a section called Ryoshicho. As soon as we were inside the house, he called out, "See here, I've brought a boy home to work for us. Be good to him." His wife and daughter came out and made a big fuss over me. They insisted that I eat and give me rice that had been stretched out with bean curd dregs, together with a huge platter of broiled fish. A day passed, and Kiheiji said, "Starting tomorrow, you can go to sea and help row a boat." I nodded, for I'd been on boat rides in Edo any number of times. "By the way, what's your name?" "Kame." He handed me a small bowl. "This is for you to pack your lunch. And be ready to leave for work every morning at 4. But don't take any food for a couple of days, because someone brought up in Edo like you won't feel like eating the first time out at sea." "Oh, I'll be all right," I assured him. "Back in Edo, I used to go out on a boat practically every day." "Well, it won't be like the sea at Edo." I decided to ignore him and bring my lunch anyways. Kiheiji took me to the home of a man who would be working on the same boat. I was told to report early the next day. I worked on the boat every day. Pretty soon the other crewmen were saying to another, "Kame sure walks in a funny way," and no wonder, my testicles were still swollen and oozing pus. I managed to hide my condition to the end, but it wasn't easy, let me tell you. We usually returned to shore about 10 in the morning. We would haul the boat about 300 or 400 yards inland and set out the nets to dry. Then each of us would be given a small share of the day's catch to peddle in Odawara. After that, I went home to do chores like buying bean curd dregs to cook with the rice or running errands in the neighborhood. Every now and then I was given 2 or 3 pennies. Kiheiji's daughter, who was about 30, was particularly nice and bought me watermelon and other treats. Her mother was something of a shrew and never gave me a moment's rest. Kiheiji worked as a coolie and was at home only in the evenings. He was truly a good and generous man and often came out of the kitchen to bring me sweets. In 14 or 15 days, he was treating me just as if I was his own son. One day, after asking about various questions about Edo, he said, "Kame, stay with us and become a member of our family." I thought about his proposal. It had been 4 months since I'd run away from home, and here I was, a samurai, wasting my time at a job that would never lead to anything. I made my mind to return to Edo and face whatever punishment my father had in store. I buttered up to Kiheiji's daughter and wheedled an old patched-up kimono from her. On the second day of the intercalary 8th month, I got out of bed about 2 in the morning, stole 300 pennies from the shelf, packed my bowl with food, and left the house with the announcement that I was off to work. I reached the outskirts of Edo around 2 early the following morning. Unfortunately, the sky was dark, and as I had passed the prison at Suzugamori, a pack of dogs surrounded me. When I yelled frantically for help, a couple of prison guards came out and shooed the dogs away. At Yoshicho in Takanawa, I found a boat, the kind used for gathering seaweed, and turned it over at me and went to sleep. I must have been very tired. I slept well past sunup, until I was roused by the angry shouts of some men in the neighborhood who had discovered me. I mumbled some excuse and hurried away. Stopping only to buy food, I arrived at Atagoyama and slept for the rest of the day. After nightfall, I pretended to leave the grounds and hid under a clump of trees. For several days I lay low, hoping that no one I knew would see me. On the 5th day, I went as far as Ryogoku Bridge. The next day, I hid in the graveyard at the Ekoin Temple and left only to buy something to eat. I used up my money and had to crawl out under from the fence every evening to beg. But not many people were willing to give me alms at night, and I was hungry most of the time. A band of beggars had staked out a corner of the graveyard. The leader asked me to come join them, so I went over and gorged myself on their food. Finally, one day I ventured as far as Kamizawa-cho. My courage deserted me at the last minute, and I retreated to a lumberyard on the other side of the Futatsume bridge for the night. 3 days later, I rose early and returned home. Everyone was excited. Kokichi's come back. Kokichi's come back. I went to my room and slept for 10 days straight. I was told that in my absence, the family had offered up all kinds of prayers and incantations, and had even sent my cousin, a nun called Keizan, all the way to Kyoto to look for me. A doctor was sent for. After examining me, he said, "Now, is there something you want to tell me about yourself below the waist?" My testicles were still in bad shape, but I stubbornly denied any trouble. Within 3 months, however, they had become so infected that I could no longer move about. I had to stay home for the next 2 years. My father reported my return to my commissioner, Ishikawa Ukon no Shogun. "It is indeed a shameful turn of events," my father said. "I will see to it that Kokichi retires and that someone is adopted to replace him as head of the Katsu family." Ishikawa agreed. If Kokichi hadn't returned by the end of this month, I would have taken measures to end the family line. But he's come back, and all's well that ends well. Leave him be. By the time he's older, he will no doubt have mended his ways and be able to perform some useful service. For now, take good care of him. All concerned were mightily relieved, I was told. I need a drink. Not that anybody's watching anyways. What is this, chapter 3? Chapter 3, Youth, 1817. I was 16. My infection had cleared up. It was decided that I should apply for official service. I went to Ishikawa's residence to pay my respects. In the front hall, there was a register for those seeking jobs to enter their names. I couldn't even write my own name, and to my great embarrassment, had to ask someone else. After I had presented myself, Ishikawa said, "Tell me about your experience as a beggar. Keep back nothing." I told him everything from the very beginning. "Well," he said, "you might say it was kind of toughening up experience, and you came through all right. I'll see to it that you get an appointment soon. Be patient." Meanwhile, the old granny of the Katsu house hadn't changed a bit. She was worse, if anything. "You really went out of your way to ruin the Katsu family, didn't you?" she said, and accused me of other offenses as well. I stayed away from home as much as possible. At my brother's office in Edo, there was a man by the name of Kuboshima Karoku. One day he tricked me into going with him to the pleasure quarters in the Yoshiwara. I enjoyed myself immensely, and after that I went every night. I used up all my money. Just as I was wondering about what to do, the annual tax money, about 7,000 ryo, arrived from the shogunate land under my brother's jurisdiction in Shinano. My brother ordered me to guard the money until it was delivered to the shogunate treasury. I kept an eye on the funds, but when my friend Karoku suggested, "Without money, it isn't much fun in Yoshiwara, is it? Go ahead and steal 100 yo." "Not a bad idea," I said, and prying open the strong box, I removed 200 yo. The box rattled suspiciously afterward, but Karoku fixed that by putting some stones wrapped in paper. The two of us went about our business looking very innocent. Several days later, my brother Hikoshiro discovered the theft, and when he angrily cross-examined everyone, the damned errand boy blurted out that I had stolen the money. My brother kept after me to return the 200 yo. I denied any knowledge of the missing money and refused to admit any wrongdoing. My brother went to my father to complain. My father said, "Hikoshiro, don't you remember getting into trouble now and then when you were young? What's the point of ruining a Kokichi's future over a little bit of money? See if you can't do something about it." It was plain as day that I had stolen the money. All the same, everyone looked the other way, and the incident was passed over. As for the 200 yo, I spent it all in Yoshiwara in less than a month and a half. After that, I had to scrounge from rice agents at the Shogunate warehouse and other moneylenders. I went to Banbacho one day to visit my cousin Chunojo. I spent the entire time talking to his sons, Shintaro and Chujiro. We were joined for a while by Genbei, a retainer in the household who had a reputation as a skilled swordsman. Kokichi-sama, Genbei said, I understand you are rather wild at times and get into scrapes, but have you ever been in an honest-to-goodness fight? If I may say so, that takes real guts. Oh, plenty, I answered. I've been in fights ever since I was a kid, and I've enjoyed every single one. Splendid, because Hachiman Shrine in Kuramae is having a festival the day after tomorrow, and there's sure to be a big fight. Why don't you come with us and test yourself? I promised to go and then went home. On the day of the festival, I went to Banbacho early in the evening. Shintaro and Chujiro were waiting for me eagerly. Ah, you've come. Genbei's at the public bathhouse. We'll leave as soon as he's back. Genbei returned while we were getting ourselves ready. On the way to Hachiman Shrine, we discussed what we would do if we ran into any trouble. All those who crossed our path hardly seemed worth fighting, but once we entered the shrine precincts, a couple of sharp-looking characters sauntered up to us humming a tune. Without warning, Chujiro spat in the face of one of the men. Outraged, the man lunged at us with one of his wooden clogs, and I punched him right in the jaw. At this, the other men came at us swinging with their fists, but when we hit back in a blind fury, they took to their heels. We strolled around the shrine grounds. We then noticed a group of about 20 men, all armed with long, hooked spears. What the... As we were wondering aloud, one of the men pointed to us and cried, Over there, they're the guys! Finding ourselves quickly surrounded, we drew our swords and flailed madly. Genbei shouted, Let's get out of here while we can. If they shut the gates, we're lost. 4 abreast, we slashed our way out of the shrine grounds. But waiting outside of the gates was a reinforcement of some 30 men with pike poles. We were 4 against 50. We fought desperately with our backs to the door of a noodle shop at the entrance to Namiki Street. Our opponents seemed to slacken after we'd wounded 4 or 5 of their men. We fought even more furiously and struck down about 10 of the pike poles. Just then, more men arrived carrying a ladder. There's no use fighting anymore, Genbei said. The 3 of you escaped to the Yoshiwara. I'll fight them off by myself. Hurry! We felt we couldn't leave him like that. No, we'll stay with you. We can all escape together. Listen, if anything happened to you, it would be terrible. Get away now while you can. Genbei was insistent. I handed Genbei my long sword in exchange for his shorter one, and without further ado, the 4 of us plunged into the midst of our opponents. As they backed off, Shintaro, Chujo, and I made a dash for it. We retired at the Kami Narimon gate in Asakusa and headed straight for the Yoshiwara. But we were still worried about Genbei, so we returned to my cousins in Banbacho for a bite to eat. To our relief and amazement, there, in front of the hall, was Genbei, calmly drinking sake. Together we went back to Hachiman Shrine. A crowd had gathered in front of the guard station at Hotagocho. We asked what had happened. There was a big fight at Hachiman, a man began to explain. It all started when some guy hit a porter. 20 or 30 of his fellow porters and about 30 workers from Kuramae got together and tried to catch the guy and his cronies. They couldn't get anyone, and besides, about 18 of their own men got hurt. There's the doctor stitching up their wounds. We left on the spot. I headed straight for my home in Kamezawa-cho. Talk about a close call. I was never so scared in my life. A sword is the samurai's most prized possession and should be chosen with great care. The blade of my sword, made by one Seki no Kanetoshi, was broken about 3.5 inches from the guard after I'd lent it to Genbei. So after that I went about learning how to appraise swords. In the fall, I went with Hikoshiro to his office in Shinano and returned to Edo toward the end of the 11th month. I continued to practice my skills in fighting under Genbei's tutelage and became quite adept. In one big fight, it was the 17th day of the 12th month, and I'd gone with my usual companions to the fair at Asakusa. Chujiro was slashed in the shoulder. The blade went straight through to his underwear, but protected by layers of clothing, he wasn't even scratched. He went to sleep that night unaware of the damage. The maid discovered the tear the next morning as she was hanging up his clothes on the hearth rack. She promptly reported it to his father, Chunojo. I received a message to come at once to Banbacho. Chunojo sat the 3 of us down before him. He delivered his opinion on the matter and made us sign a pledge never again to take part in a fight. Chunojo, I should add, was known for his extremely virtuous character and regarded with awe by all his relatives as a veritable sage. It was New Year's. I went to Banbacho to visit Chujiro and Shintaro. The two were in the garden practicing their fencing. They asked me to join in, but the moment I tried out with Chujiro, I received a stunning blow in the torso and fainted. As soon as I recovered, I tried again and again, but to my chagrin, I failed to hit him even once. So after talking it over with Chujiro, I decided to study fencing with his master, Master Danno Genoshin of the Jikishinkage Ryu school. My former teacher was put out and made a lot of noise about it, but I paid no attention. I was eager to improve quickly and threw myself into practice. The following year, I was initiated into 2 secret techniques. No longer at the mercy of every blow, I started going to a Jikishinkage Ryu practice hall. All the students sought out to me, saying, "Kokichi this and Kokichi that." I also engaged heedlessly in matches with students from rival schools of fencing. This was frowned upon by teachers at the time, when fencing was not as popular as it is now, and since most students refrained, I found that they were usually no match for me. It was the year that I was 18. I went with Shintaro and Chujiro to request a match with Iku Masazaemon, a master at the Ito Ryu school who had lived under the Umamichi section of Asakusa. He consented right off and led us to his practice hall. I was matched against one of his students, and as if it were my first try there, I fought with all my might and won handily. We went through a series of matches, and it came time for Chujiro to pit himself against Masazaemon. He struck Masazaemon right in the torso and sent him reeling against a wooden door. The door fell out, and Masazaemon landed on his back. As he struggled to get up, Chujiro dealt him several blows on the belly. We decided to call it quits, but I still got angry at Masazaemon for the way he'd boasted in the beginning, so on the way out I ripped off his name plaque in the front hall and took it with me. Later the same day, we went on a spree. On another occasion, I went with my friends Kamio, Fukazu, and Takahama to the home of Yamaguchi Soma in Bakurocho to request a match. Soma invited us, but began to treat us in a condescending manner. Then when we asked for a match, he had the gall to say, "Not this evening, come back some other time." To get even, Takahama slashed at the curtain hanging in the doorway and flung at us inside. By now all the students in Shitaya, Asakusa, and Honjo, who engaged in matches with rival schools, were taking orders from me. I stuck a 2-foot 8-inch sword at my side and swaggered about as though I were a regular sword master. One by one, the leading students of masters like Inoue Denbei, he had a great many at this time, Fujikawa Chikayoshi, and Akaishi Fuyu, not to mention Master Danno, became my underlings. We went about challenging everyone to matches, and by good luck we always won. Yes, you could say that I was responsible for the new vigor and popularity of other schools of fencing. The following summer, Tatewaki, the son of Nakamura Itsuki, a Shinto priest who presided at the Amano-miya Daimyojin shrine in Kagegawa in Totomi province, came up to Edo. I put in a good word for him when I heard that he was trying to enroll at the school of Ishikawa Seiheiji. It seems that during a visit with Tatewaki and his family, Ishikawa had fought a match with Tatewaki's teacher, somebody named Hayata, and treated him soundly. Puffed up with success, he then had apparently sat Hayata on his knee and taught him how to handle a spear. Tatewaki had taken all this in and, thoroughly convinced that Ishikawa was a master swordsman, had come all the way to Edo to study with Ishikawa. Everyone knew that as far as fencing teachers went, Ishikawa was the very worst, but what can you expect of a country bumpkin? In any event, Tatewaki worked hard, received a certificate, and went back to Kakegawa. That same year, I went again to Shinano. My brother, who was in poor health at the time, sent me to the village of Sakaki, and determined the rice tax for the coming year. I deliberately chose a measuring rod's worth of the poorest paddy in the village as a sample. It yielded a mere 1.25 sho of rice. I ordered half of the amount as the tax to be paid on all of the rice paddy fields in the village. The peasants were delighted. About the same time, a samurai named Sakurai, a kinsman of the Nita Manjiro in Kosuke province, tried to wheedle some money out of the peasant officials who worked at the district office. A heated argument broke out, and Sakurai drew his sword and wounded a peasant. A posse was rounded up to capture him, but no one dared go near Sakurai, who had stationed himself at the office gate and threatened to slice anyone who came near with his 2-foot 6-inch sword. Several retainers were dispatched from my brother's office, but they too were frightened off and stood about wringing their hands. My brother said, "Kokichi, go get Sakurai." I ran to the spot, but with only 4 feet between Sakurai and the gate, I realized it would be impossible to reach him. I would have to think of something very quickly. Just then, an outcast in the village came up to me and said, "Sir, I have a plan." He charged at Sakurai with a 6-foot pole. The pole was immediately cut in half, but while Sakurai was holding his sword aloft, the outcast grappled with him. The outcast was slashed from the waist to his crotch. In the same instant, I flung a handful of sand into Sakurai's face. Blinded momentarily, he lurched forward. The outcast grabbed him by the testicles and pulled him to the ground. A couple of other outcasts jumped on Sakurai and bound him with a rope. He was thrown in the office jail, and further negotiations were conducted directly with his kinsman, Nite in Kozuke. The outcast who had been wounded from the village of Sakaki. The outcast who had been wounded came from the village of Sakaki. He was rewarded by the government with a generous stipend of about 32 bales of rice a year, more than enough to support a family for the rest of his lifetime. A cripple for life, true, but as fearless a man you'll ever find. My brother kept me busy, sending me here and there to assess the rice crop. Then one day we received word that our mother had died. We hastily finished what official business there was left and set out for Edo. On the way at Oiwake in Shinano, my brother noticed that a man was with a half-shaved pate and surreptitiously joined our group and hidden himself among the stable boys. He ordered me to seize the intruder. I took an iron truncheon from the side of the palanquin and went looking for him. As soon as he saw me, he broke into a run in the direction of Mount Asama. I chased him, but when I finally caught up with him, he put his hands on his longsword and said, "Honorable official, please let me escape." "Let you go? Never." I edged closer. He drew his sword about a foot, but I noticed that the tip of the scabbard had gotten caught in his rain cape. I immediately hurled myself at him, grabbed the handle of his sword, and turned with a somersault. We both tumbled to the ground, with the man landing on top. At that moment, Kitoji, a peasant official from the village of Hiraga, arrived and, taking hold of the rascal by the head, turned him over. I shook myself free and gave the man a beating with my truncheon. Kitoji and I tied him up and led him back to the post station at Oiwake. By and by, the officials of the shogunate offices at Ueda and Komoro came to take custody of the fellow. We were told that his name was Otokichi, and that he was a gambler with as many as 100 followers. He evidently had been locked up for 200 days in Komoro prison, but he had escaped one night and had gone to Oiwake. We had caught him just after he'd forced his way into a brothel and talked them into giving him 1 ryo. Otokichi was eventually handed over to the shogunate office in Nakanojo, rather than having the local daimyo, who we were certain would have beheaded him. My brother said that I could keep Otokichi's sword. It was a fine specimen, forged by the Ikeda Kijin Maru Kunishige, and measuring 2 feet 8 inches. I used it as my everyday sword. We resumed our trip. During a rest at the Musui Pass, a young samurai in the service of an elder of the Komoro domain behaved very rudely to us. I and a retainer, Shiozawa Enzo, picked him up bodily and slammed him against his master's palanquin. Another incident took place in Anaka and Kozuke. For some reason, a local swordsman suddenly bared his sword and attacked Tsunezo, one of our men. That time, too, Enzo and I overpowered him and tied him up with a rope. When we handed the fellow to the officials at the Anaka post station, we were told that he'd probably had to drink too much to drink. We arrived in Edo early in the 11th month. Once again, I roamed about, challenging students of other schools to duels. A fencing master named Kondo Yanosuke lived in the Warigesui section of Honojo. He had a student, Kobayashi Hayata, who had a reputation as a bully who terrorized everyone in sight. One day, Kobayashi slyly suggested to Ono Kenichi, a known rowdy in the service of the Tsugaru domain, to challenge me to a match. Kenichi turned up to my house. I had heard that he was considered one of Nakanishi Chubei's top students, but even so, I found his bragging hard to take. At one point, the damn fool just thrust his sword at me and said, "Just look at it. There's nobody in the entire domain of Tsuguru who owns a sword like this." I picked it up and examined it closely. The sword had been made in the province of Sagami and was at least 2 feet 7.5 inches long. I murmured a few words of praise only to hear him brag again. I got up and showed him my own 3 foot 1 inch sword that had been given to me by no less than Master Hirayama Shiryu. Kenkichi flinched at the sight of it, so I took the opportunity to indulge in some boasting myself. "Let's have a match," I said. The coward at first declined. "All right, but not today," he finally agreed. We settled on a date for a match at Kenichi's practice hall. I alerted my fellow swordsmen in Shitaya, and on the appointed day of 40 or 50 showed up. Kenichi, however, was nowhere to be seen. I sent a note to his home, and a reply came back saying that he'd come right over to my house. I waited at home, and the big bully Kobayashi himself turned up rigged out in formal clothes. He tried to smooth things over. "Can't you overlook this? I'll see to it that Kenichi apologizes." "Are you sure of this?" "Oh yes, and if by chance Kenichi bothers you in the future, Katsusama, this head on my shoulders is as good as yours." I let it go at that. After this incident, practically all of Hanojo came under my control. A feud broke out among the public bathhouse operators when one of them announced that he was moving to his establishment from Shibe Katayamame to Mukomachi. A priest at the Zojoji temple had offered to secure the good offices of the town magistrate, Sakakibara, and received 20 ryo from the graceful bathhouse operator. Nothing but a hoax, of course. When the unsuspecting bathhouse operator applied to the magistrate's office for permission to move, the officials would have nothing to do with him, saying that public bathhouses were the concern of Tariya San Uemon, and that furthermore, he had neglected to observe the proper procedure. The operator was in great distress. A friend, Nakano Seijiro, came to see if I could help. I said, "Fortunately, the daughter of a cousin of mine has married into the Tariya family. I am on good terms with her father, Masami, so I'll see what I can do." Sakano was overjoyed and several days later came by the house with the bathhouse operator. I went to see Masami and after explaining the situation to him, persuaded him to take care of the matter. In due course, the application was issued by the magistrate's office and a hearing held among all parties concerned, and the operator given permission to move. Jubilant, he gave 30 ryo to Tariya, 20 to Masami, and 40 to me. Nakano said later that the stock of the bathhouse was held by the mistress of a man in the service of the Sakai Saemon, and that the move to the new premises was expected to increase its value by 80 ryo. That year I accompanied my brother Hikoshiro to the village of Suibara in Echigo province, where he had been newly assigned as district administrator. I toured the entire territory under his jurisdiction and had a very good time. For one thing, the peasants in the area were well-to-do, so I got all kinds of rare and costly objects. For another, I was given a lot of money and kimono to take back with me to Edo. Back in Edo, I learned that Kobayashi Hayata had switched from Kondo Yanosuke's school to the Otani school, and that he was working hard at fencing. He was also still bullying everyone and lording it over his fellow students. I was a mind to teach him a lesson, but I had to stay in bed with a bad cold, so I let things be for the time being. Feeling better one day, I went to the practice hall and attended the midwinter session. Kobayashi came up to me. "Katsusama, may I request a match?" "As you see, I've been sick and haven't properly even gotten around to having my head shaved properly, but since you ask, I'll oblige." I won the first round easily and the second also. Kobayashi threw down his sword in disgust and tackled me. I pulled him across my hip and threw him to the floor. He went sprawling on his back. I planted my foot on his belly and pointed my sword at his throat. Kobayashi got up and tore off his guard mask. He was mad with rage. "How dare you put your filthy foot on a samurai?" "Ha, I'm glad you said that. Didn't you say something about, since this being our first match, how you, a rank amateur, would like some instructions? Well, I was only showing what the winner does after he's beaten a fellow samurai in a match. Any objections?" "Oh, none at all. You are quite right." After that, Kobayashi shouted me around, looking for a chance to ambush me. Now and again, he would catch me off guard on a deserted street and tear my howdy with his sword, but he never so much as managed to scratch me. He wouldn't give up, though. I had to remain watchful. One day, toward the end of the year, I'd gone to a relative to borrow money to pay off my debts. A very drunken Kobayashi suddenly came reeling out of a side alley. He thrust his sword right under my nose. It was broad daylight, and a crowd quickly gathered around us. I tucked my hands in my kimono sleeves and said, "Well, well, what are you up to, waving your dull old sword around at this time of day?" "I just bought this sword, you see, and was wondering if you could tell me what you thought of the blade." I looked at it. "Should cut right through the bone." Kobayashi returned the sword to his sheath and walked away. A scoundrel, if there ever was one. At 18, I took a wife and moved to a new house on my brother's property in Kamezawa-cho. For the occasion, he gave me someone's promissory note for 300 ryo and the rent from the same man's house. My father gave me a complete set of household furnishings. I was pleased to be free of debt, but what with so many people sponging off me, I was in debt again in no time. I turned 19. I went to the Otani practice hall for the first fencing session of the new year. Higashima Jinsuke and Hirakawa Sakigo got into a fencing argument and challenged each other to a duel outside. As I broke up the fight and talked them into making up. I was now ordering the swordsmen in the area as though they were my underlings. I sent them off to the provinces to improve their skills, and since they all claimed to be my students, my name gradually spread far and wide. I demolished every good-for-nothing in my own neighborhood of Honjo. Everybody obeyed me. I feared absolutely no one. But all this took a lot of money. Appearances had to be kept up, and I fell further and further into debt. Challenging students from rival schools was getting to be a regular occupation. Night after night, I roamed the streets with my followers in tow. Every so often, just to keep them in their place, I took them to the home of Master Hirayama Shiryu to hear him tell stories of heroes in China and Japan. My foolishness was dragging me deeper into debt. I wouldn't stop even then, and borrowed money with no prospect of being able to repay. I was 21 and penniless. I had no choice but to sell my everyday sword, the Morimitsu I'd bought for 41 ryo from the dealer Owariya Kume Uemon. At the last moment, I couldn't bear to part with it. Even to make an appearance at the commissioner's house, I had only to close my back. To take my mind off my woes, I went to the Yoshiwara. And then, for the next chapter, I need a quick restroom break. BRB. All right. What is this, chapter 4? Chapter 4. I run away again. I decided to run away again. I pawned what possessions I had, including the sword my father had given me, borrow from my fellow swordsman, and managed to scrape together 3.5 ryo. The night before my escape, I made another visit to the Yoshiwara. In the morning, I went to the Inoue practice hall at Kurumazaka, borrowed a set of fencing gear, and took off immediately for the Tokaido post road. I walked and walked until I was ready to drop. I stayed the night at Fujisawa and got off to an early start the next day to look up my old friend Kiheiji in Odawara. He was puzzled at first, for how was he to know that the samurai standing before him was the young beggar he befriended long ago? He finally recognized me when I said, "Remember me, Kame, the boy who worked for you and left without saying goodbye?" Kiheiji invited me in, and as we were having food and sake, I confessed how I'd stolen 300 copper pennies. I gave him a little over half a ryo and added an extra 1/8 ryo so that my cronies from my fishing days could all join us for sake. When I told them laughingly that I'd become a professional swordsman, they were flabbergasted. They urged me to stay for the night, but I was anxious to go on to Hakone. Any moment, someone might come from Edo in hot pursuit. Kiheiji and several of the men insisted on coming as far as the Sanmaibashi Bridge to see me off. I waved them goodbye and headed out for the barrier station at Hakone. Of course, I had no travel permit. I walked up to the outer veranda office. "Excuse me, sir, I'm a swordsman traveling to the provinces to improve my skills. Would you kindly let me through?" Show us your papers," one of the officials said. "As you can see, I am dressed for the streets of Edo. The idea of going to the western provinces came to me on a spur of the moment, and just as I was leaving in the practice hall. I'm afraid applying for a travel permit was the furthest thing from my mind. Look, I have only my rush sandals with no traveling clothes to speak of. I beg of you to let me through." A man who looked as if he might be the head official said, "It is decreed by the shogun himself that no one without a travel permit may pass. But if what you say is true and you are indeed traveling to improve your fencing, we will make an exception. Be prepared the next time. Most grateful, very kind of you." I hurried through the barrier station and sat down to catch my breath. A tradesman who was also traveling overtook me. "Young sir," he said, "as I was going through the barrier station, I overheard the officials talking about you. They were wondering what kind of samurai you were. They knew you weren't a courier and were quite certain you weren't in the service of a daimyo." "Well, why shouldn't they be puzzled? I'm an honorable daimyo." That took care of him. Nightfall came in early in the mountains, and although the touts at the inns pestered me to spend the night, I was determined to cover the 10 miles to Mishima. It was the last day of the 5th month, and with no moon ahead to guide me, I took off my sandals, tucked them into my waistband, and picked my way through the dark. It was midnight by the time I arrived in Mishima. I rapped on the door of an inn. "Let me stay for the night." Under the orders from the district administrator at Nirayama, we're not allowed to put up anyone traveling alone, someone answered. I went to the transport office of the post station and woke up one of the men to see if he could arrange for me to stay at the inn. "We can't do that, against official orders." "Are you telling me that a retainer in the service of Harima no Kami of Mito can't stay at the inn on the Tokaido? I'll have you know that I am on official business, entrusted with a request for prayers at the Amano Miya shrine in Totomi. But if that's what you say, I suppose I shall have to go back to the residence of the post road magistrate and take it up with him. I'll be leaving my baggage here in any case, so keep an eye on it, would you?" I tossed my fencing gear through the door in the front room. At this, several officials came out in a fluster and threw themselves on the earthen floor. "Oh, if we had only known you were from the Harima no Kami, please forgive us for our rudeness." I decided to press them further. "I'll be leaving my things here for the time being. Give me a receipt." This upset them even more, and now several other officials came out groveling. "We'll do anything you say, but first won't you please rest at the inn for a while?" "Show the way." They conducted me to the inn annex, all the while apologizing for their oversight, and brought out some food. "Please understand," they pleaded in one voice. "If you don't forgive us, we'll lose our jobs." No longer put out, I said I would forgive them. The officials plied with me for more food, but when I asked again for a receipt, they seemed to loathe to hand it over. So for a second time I pretended to be angry, and this time they tried to placate me with money. 1.5 ryo to be exact. It was entirely unexpected. I took the money and let it go at that. By now it was nearing daybreak. Although I hadn't slept a wink, I felt it was time for me to leave Mishima. The officials furnished a palanquin, and I was able to sleep all the way to the next post station. All in all, things had worked out just nicely, and why not? Just after leaving Hakone, I tried a tag marked Mito to my fencing gear. Of one thing I was certain. I had nothing to fear, for in setting out on my travels around Japan, I had resolved that if I need, I would die by the sword. I arrived at the banks of the Oi River. The water level was dangerously high, and the coolies were charging 96 pennies to carry passengers across. I went up to the office for river coolies and called out, "I am on urgent business for the domain of Mito. Take me over at once." A coolie came hurrying out. "Very important business," I repeated. "I am the Honorable Harima no Kami." "I am the Honorable Harima no Kami." I gave the coolie the fee for one passenger. My baggage was taken separately, while I was carried high over the swirling waves on a litter borne by 4 coolies. It was most agreeable. I was now at the post station of Kakegawa in the province of Totomi. I knew that Nakamura Tatewaki lived nearby, and remembering how I'd once done him a favor, I decided to visit him. Walking up to the transport office, I said, "I am on the way to see Nakamura Itsuki, the head priest at Amanomori Shrine. I must deliver a request for prayers for the Mito domain. A palanquin, if you please." One was provided right away. I was taken to Mori, a post station on the Akiba Post Road. As soon as the station officials heard from bearers that I was an emissary from Mito, they dispatched a message to the Nakamura family. Father and son arrived within minutes. I poked my head at the palanquin. Tatewaki's mouth fell open. "Katsu, what in the world are you doing here?" "I'll explain everything. Wait till you get to your house." At his house, Tatewaki's father thanked me warmly for looking after his son in Edo. I told them what I'd been up to lately. And then when I got to Kakegawa, I thought of you and decided to pay a visit. Well, you must stay as long as you like, they said, and gave me use of the sitting room. The family saw to my every comfort. I made myself at home, engaging in matches at the local practice hall and doing whatever I pleased. Soon I had 4 or 5 students lined up. I gave lessons every day. It seemed pointless to stay much longer, however, and I had just made up my mind to go on further west when an itinerant swordsman from Choshu called Joichi Soma passed through the village. We had a couple of matches, but afterwards, while I was copying a list of the places he'd visited, he fell sick and asked if he could rest for several days. I couldn't very well leave him, so I spent the time preparing for my departure. One evening, Itsuki took me aside. I really think you should go back to Edo, he said. I appreciate you worrying about me, but I can never go back. You see, this is the second time I've run away. Then at least stay here until the end of the 7th month. You don't want to travel in this heat. Having accepted his hospitality all this time, I didn't see how I could refuse. The family treated me even more kindly. I was busier than ever, for besides the students in the neighborhood, young men from the surrounding area were turning up for lessons. I was given kimono and money, and all my daily necessities were free, since my students had me charge them to their accounts. In Sakisaka, about some 17 miles away, I had an old friend, Sakisaka Asataro, who had been a student of Inoue Denbei in Kuramazaka. As the district administrator, he was set up very comfortably and looked after me generously when I went there for a visit. Before I knew it, it was the 3rd day of the 7th month. One morning I was tidying up the sitting room in preparation for a visit from Ishikawa Seiheiji, Tatewaki's old teacher, when my nephew Shintaro suddenly appeared. He said, "I've come to take you back to Edo. The family was afraid if anyone else were sent, you'd hack them to pieces. Come back with me now. After that, it's up to you." Itsuki also strongly urged me to go home. I agreed to return, and then left the next day with Shintaro. During a stop at the post station in Mishima, Shintaro fainted and threw everyone into a panic. He finally came to, but we rode palanquins for the rest of the trip. Back in Edo, neither my father nor brother said a word. I returned to my own house with some relief. The following day, I was invited by Hikoshiro to a lavish dinner. In the evening, I received a summons from my father. I went right away. "Kokichi," he said, "I hope you realize that you've been behaving very badly, and because I am ordering you to stay home for a while. I want you to think long and hard about your life. You'll find that the answers won't come easily, so you might as well take your time straightening things out, a couple of years even. And since people ought to have a measure of learning, it wouldn't hurt if you looked at some books too." On returning home, I saw that a cage the size of 3 tatami mats had been set up in the middle of the sitting room. I was thrown inside. Inside the cage, I jiggled the bars, and in less than a month, I had figured a way how to remove 2 of them. I also reflected on my past conduct and came to the conclusion that whatever had happened had been my fault. I taught myself to read and write, and spent hours poring over military manuals. I was allowed to have visitors, and looked forward to their news about the outside world. In this manner, I was to pass 3 years. From the fall of the year I was 21 to the winter of the year I was 24. It was an extremely painful period. My father occasionally sent me written advice. I wrote to him one day that I would like to retire and relinquish the family headship to my son, Norintaro, who was now 3 years old. This was his answer. "I think that is a bad idea. It's true you've been guilty of misconduct in the past, but I would like to see you serve in some government post, however briefly, and put a stop to the gossip about you. I would also like to see you render some filial piety towards your adoptive family. After that, you may do as you wish." What he said, I realized, was completely fair. I sent a note to Hikoshiro saying I wished to seek official employment. He wrote back, "If you think you can get together the necessary clothes and equipment on your own, that's your affair. For my part, I've already spent more than enough on you. I won't help this time." I happened to be in bed with a big boil on my face. I sent my brother a message that I had no intention of bothering him in the future and got out of the cage. The next day I went to see the agent who had handled the Katsu family house and persuaded him to advance me 20 ryo. Within 10 days, I had assembled all the items I would need to work and was ready to present myself at the commissioner's residence. Chapter 5, Adult Years. Approximately 1825. Every morning, I put on my kataginyu and hakama. I made the rounds on the powers that be. I went to the Commissioner Okubo Kozu Kenosuke's home in Akasaka Kuichigaisoto and begged him to recommend me for a post. I even submitted a list of misdeeds I'd committed, adding a request that I be considered now that I had repented. An agent came from his office one day. He said, "Be forewarned that Okubo-sama will be sending out investigators to gather information on you." I waited expectantly. Okubo spoke to me one morning. "Your followers simply refuse to tell on you, and though you've confessed everything, we find in investigating that the mischief you've done is far more serious than you say. Be that as it may, you've repented, and that's good enough for me. I will do my best to get you an appointment. Continue your report diligently." I showed up at his residence with renewed fervor and practiced fencing in my spare time. Often enough, my name was entered in the rolls of candidates, but not once was I given a post. That I found very galling. I badgered my father and brother into letting me set up a separate residence. I decided to build a house in Waregesui on the property of Amano Sakyo. I rented the second floor of his house until it was ready. Sakyo became seriously sick all of a sudden and died. I did what I could for the bereaved family. We moved into our new house. Sakyo's son and heir, Kinjiro, was then only 2 years old, when the time came to request formal succession of the family headship. Amano Izawa, a member of the main branch of the family who bore an old grudge against Sakyo, started making things difficult. He tried to have the branch line ended, and with everybody squabbling, it looked as though the matter would never be settled. I was friendly with both branches of the family, so I stepped in and saw to it that Kinjiro was recognized as family head. His family, much pleased, asked me to continue to look after their affairs. Sakyo's widow now began acting strangely, throwing herself at every man who came her way. It was one scandal after another, and though we'd just settled into our new house, I decided to sell and move out. I applied for permission to use the commissioner of Kinjiro's unit. The agent in charge said, "If you leave, there's no telling what might happen to the Amano family. Stay on for a year or so." I obliged, but wasn't happy about it. Fixing others' troubles was all very well, but what about my own? Then one day an old man gave me a piece of advice. People are wont to repay a good deed with ingratitude. Well, why don't you be different and try returning a good deed for every act of ill will? I did as he said, and curiously enough, not only did my family situation improve, but even my mean old grandmother began acting more decently. I found, moreover, that people were constantly seeking my help. Whenever a sticky problem or negotiation came up, I dealt with it as though I myself were involved. So in that time, even those who had been against me came over to my side, saying, "Yes, indeed, how right you are." I realized I owed all this to the old man's counsel. In my happiness, I aided fellow swordsmen who'd gotten into trouble or hopelessly into debt, giving them cash or sending them someplace out of harm's way. How many I helped, I'll never know, but it paid off nicely years later when I traveled in the provinces. No matter where I went, I was recognized and treated exceedingly well. 2 years had passed since Sakyo's death. His widow was still behaving scandalously. I received permission to move to a house on the property of Deguchi Tetsugoro, who lived in the same section of town. His oldest son was a friend from way back, and ever since I had helped him when he had a falling out with his family, his grateful grandmother had been urging me to come live on their land. I continued to report regularly on the commissioner's residence. I also had to make ends meet, so I tried my hand at dealing in swords and other military accoutrements. In the beginning, I lost money, 50 or 60 ryo the first month and a half, but I got used to the business little by little, and by attending the second-hand goods market every night, I found I could really bring in profits. I was anxious to find official employment, but I also had to dash about making money. Then my father died, and I lost heart completely. His death was entirely unexpected. It seems he'd had a stroke. I was giving fencing lessons at Mazaki Inari Shrine when one of his young retainers came running in with the news. I raced to my father's place, but it was too late. I stayed on, helping out, and left the following morning. My next few days were taken up with my father's affairs. My own son was then 5. I went back to my business as soon as the mourning period of 49 days was completed. It was in the fall of the same year that I first heard of Yoshida Hyogo, a Shinto priest of the Marishiten cult in Sarue in Honjo. A number of my friends had taken up Shinto practices under his guidance and were eager to have me join them. I went to visit Hyogo one day and we were soon friendly. Katsu-sama, I understand you have a wide following, he said. I wonder if you would set up an association for my shrine. I am thinking of calling it the Day of the Boar Association. After agreeing to try, I decided that the members should pay 3 mon plus 3 go a month. Merchants were invited, as were peasants, not to mention my fellow swordsmen. In a month or so, I had lined up about 100 or 50 or 160 members. I drew up a list of the membership and showed it to Hyogo. He was very pleased. A year and a half later, the association had grown to 500 or 600 subscribers, all thanks to me. Hyogo then said to me, as a propitiation and thanksgiving to the gods, I would like to hold a performance of sacred dances on the Day of the Boar in the 10th month. I called together 38 members who would act as sponsors for the occasion and told them to spread word of the event. I also said that Hyogo wanted them to come dressed in formal kimono for the edification of the pilgrims, that he himself would be in full ceremonial attire. On the day of the festivities, throngs of pilgrims poured into the shrine grounds. The street in front of the shrine was lined up with booths that had been set up by merchants. It wasn't every day you could count on a crowd like this. Members of the association were regaled with food and drink as they arrived. That damned Hyogo couldn't hold his liquor, though, and was acting up as if he owned 1,000,000 koku of land somewhere off in Nishi no Kubo. He was also talking rot and nonsense and bossing around my friend Miyagawa Tetsujiro. I lost my temper and bawled him out, and when he answered back with some insulting remarks, I walked off, taking my friend with me. The following day, several members of the association came to apologize. Listen, I told them, if it hadn't been for me, this association never would have been formed. And what do I get? Not a word of thanks. The way that idiot Hyogo goes sounding off, you'd think he'd done it all by himself. You can tell him I'm resigning. Ogashira Ihei, Hashimoto Shohei, and Mogami Ikugoro tried to reason with me. You have a point there, Katsu-san, but you did go to a lot of trouble to put the association together, and if you leave, everyone else would leave too. Why, Hyogo is probably regretting it even now and intending to apologize, so forgive him this once, will you? All right, but only on the condition that he write a note saying he'll never again insult an honorable bannerman of the shogun. Oh, we'll make him do anything you say. They left, and in a while I headed for Hyogo's place with Miyagawa and Fukatsu Kinjiro. Ogashira Ihei came part way to meet with us. He said, Hyogo's put on his ceremonial robes for your visit. He's coming out to the gate to receive you, and then he's going to conduct you to the sitting room and formally apologize for his behavior yesterday. We've made sure of this, so please speak with him. Very well. And by the way, Katsu-san, the sponsors of the association are holding a banquet in your honor. We'd appreciate it if you didn't mention yesterday's incident. As you wish, but you'd better make sure that no one else talks about it either, because if someone does, it'll mean the sponsors are nothing but a bunch of liars. I'm warning you, I've come today with every intention of cutting down anybody who stands in my way. I said this with particular earnest and sent Ihei on his way. Hyogo and the sponsors were waiting at the front gate. They led me to the sitting room, and after I had taken my place at the head of the room, I put my sword on the sword rack. Everyone sat down. Hyogo prostrated himself on the floor. Yesterday, not only did I get drunk and behaved with extreme rudeness. Please forgive me. I promise to act henceforth with more circumspection. I said, You're nothing but a back-alley Shinto priest and probably don't know any better. I rebuked you yesterday because you were unspeakably rude to me, an honorable bannerman of the shogun. No sooner does the association show signs of flourishing than you getting puffed up with conceit. I advise you to be more careful in the future if you want the association to continue. With this, the members began fawning on me, pressing me to eat and drink. I don't like sake, so I sat back and watched the others make drunken fools of themselves. Among those present were Hyogo's nephew, Otake Gentaro. Indignant that I had called his uncle a back-alley priest, he apparently wormed the details of yesterday's incident out of Miyagawa. He burst into the room. That Kokichi keeps meddling in people's business, and just because his friend Miyagawa humiliates my uncle in front of everybody. From now on, he's going to have to deal with me. Come on, Kokichi, let's settle it outside. Though still dressed in his formal kimono, Otake had bared one of his shoulders and tied a cotton band around his head. When I ignored him, he marched up to me and began making a scene. "Oh ho," I said. "Otake must have taken leave of his senses. Just look at him, wearing a headband like some common roughneck, itching for a fight. Samurai should act like samurai, I say. And as for one myself, I disprove your behavior fit of a servant or a sweeper." "You brazen son of a..." Otake picked up a tray and hurled it at me. I said, "Hyogo's to blame for this nonsense in violation of our agreement, and seeing as how his own nephew attacks me, I'll have to conclude that all this was planned beforehand. All right, I accept your challenge." "Eat," Otake snarled. Determined to strike first, I reached for my sword. Everyone scurried out of the room, including Otake, who bolted for the kitchen. I ran after him, but lost my bearings and found myself in a storage room. I was moreover unable to get out, for someone had slammed the door and gotten some men to lean against it. A crowd gathered near the door and began talking at once. They begged me to forgive Otake, who they said had been scared out of his wits, thrown down both swords, and fled to his home in Iodonobashi. I said that his behavior is inexcusable. Several others joined in trying to intercede, among them Otake's mother. In tears she implored me to forgive her son. I relented and told them to send for Otake. Otake came back full of apologies. "I'm afraid I had too much to drink, and considering that we are under the same commissioner, I'd be particularly grateful if you didn't report this." I decided to make peace. Sake was served again. "Have a drink," Otake said. "No thanks, I never touched the stuff." You're not drinking because we haven't really become friends." Reluctantly, I took a sip. Everybody crowded around me and said, "Let's see you drink soup from a bowl." That irked me, so I took a bowlful and emptied it in one gulp. Just one more," they all cried. I drank 13 bowls in a roll. By this time, the rest of the members were far gone in their cups, behaving like boors, but I remained sober and in perfect control of myself. Hyogo ordered a palanquin to take me home. I must have passed out, because I remember only going as far as Hashimoto Shoemon's house in Hayashicho. For 3 days, my throat was so swollen that I couldn't swallow a thing. The next day, some friends came to report on the latest goings-on at Hyogo's house. Hashimoto and Fukatsu stayed behind after the others had left. They each brought out a written pledge and said, "We have a request, Katsu-san. From now on, please treat us as if we were your kinsmen." After this episode, the Honjo area was more than ever under my control. In my opinion, Hyogo was a thoroughly bad sort. I severed all connections with the association. The other members I persuaded to join left too, and I heard the whole thing fell apart. I went to see Hashimoto Shoemon on my way home from Myoken Shrine one day. He had a visitor by the name of Tonomura Nanpei. As the three of us chatted about this and that, Tonomura suddenly turned to me and said, "Katsu-san, you must be a believer of the goddess Myoken. Tell me, am I right?" "Yes, I've been devoted to her for a long time." "Just as I thought. I could tell from the features on your face." It turned out that Tonomura not only knew all kinds of strange and marvelous facts, but he was a practitioner of the Ryobu Shingon arts. He struck me as an interesting man. Hashimoto asked him about a relative who was very sick. Tonomura said, "I'm sorry to say that your relative has been possessed by a dead person's spirit." "Have you any idea who it is?" "The dead person was a male," he said, and went to describe the man's age, appearance, and manner of death as if he'd seen him with his own eyes. I asked Hashimoto, "What about it?" Hashimoto said the description fit exactly a man he knew. I was terribly impressed and asked Tonomura if he would take me on as a student. He said, "Very well, I shall instruct you the best I can." That same evening, I took him home to spend the night. Tonomura first introduced me to the teachings of the Ryobu Shingon school, and then showed me the correct way to worship Inari, the fox deity. Over the next 2 months, he taught me how to recite mantras and incantations for the sick, how to communicate with the goddess Marishiten, how to master aesthetic discipline, and many other techniques and practices as well. In return, I took care of his daily needs. He was somewhat seedy looking. Counting fees and other expenses, in a year and a half, I'd spent close to 40 or 50 ryo on him. People came from all over Honjo to study the Tonomura, and he soon had so many students that he had to move to the residence of Ogura Chikara, who lived in the opposite Mirokuji temple. He was besieged with requests for prayers and incantations, for the sick and the afflicted, for no appointment to office, and for every other purpose you could think of. but since I had been the one who had discovered him, he was always happy to oblige me. Kondo Yanosuke's student, Kobayashi Hayata, finally became my follower. He came to the house every day and made himself useful in various ways. He had no place of his own, however, I got a house for him in Iraya in Asakusa, where there was a number for sale. I then told my fellow swordsman to help him set up a practice hall. It became popular with men around Shitaya, and before long he was able to start a side business as a sword dealer. He was good at it and began lending money to his friends. Kobayashi was also cunning and often cheated his friends unscrupulously. On 3 occasions, he borrowed to the hilt and ran away to Totomi. I will say this for him. He always gave me notice before taking off. On the other hand, each time he came back to Edo, I had to write notes asking his friends to forgive him, and naturally they were stuck with their losses. Kobayashi is in Totomi again, having made off with some 70 or 80 ryo. He has yet to show his face, but according to Kojima no Kane, someone I met in Choshi, he's more or less shaped up. Kane told me that he met Kobayashi during a pilgrimage to the Horaiji temple in Akiba. It seems they sat down and talked about me for several hours. He also said that Kobayashi turned out rather smartly. One day at Ogura Chikara's house, I met a tailor from Kuromon-cho who was in charge of the lots for shadow lotteries. It happened that my friend Tokiyama Kazue had been very keen on lotteries. On the day that lots were to be drawn for the official shrine lottery, he asked Tonomura Nanpei to recite some incantations to invoke the gods. Word got around, and quickly a crowd gathered at Ogura's house, where Tonomura still lived. He was just about to begin when I unknowingly dropped by. When it was explained to me that the incantation was to find out the winning numbers in the official lottery, I decided to stay and watch. Tonomura called in a woman, intoned some prayers, and lit a sacred fire with cedar twigs. He then handed the woman a sacred staff decorated with paper streamers and bade her to commune with the gods. In a while, she began to babble. Today, 6 is the lucky number. Lots 16, 26, 36. All present were delighted. Tonomura started putting things away. I said to him, "I've never seen anything like this. I'm quite impressed. But I wonder if it's all that difficult." The tailor from Kuromon-cho spoke up. "I realize that it's you, Katsu-sama, not some ordinary person who is speaking. But reciting incantations is no simple matter. There are rules to this, you understand." "I see what you mean," I answered. "But consider for a moment. Tonomura here, we've no idea which horse's rib he's made of or where he's from, and he manages fine. Now if I, by birth an exalted bannerman of the shogun, put my heart and soul into it, it stands to reason that the gods will swiftly heed my prayers. So when I ask Tonomura something, I'll thank you to keep quiet." The tailor was not about to back down. "But Katsu-sama, I still think it's beyond your powers. In all things pertaining to the gods, certain rules must be observed." I strode to the middle of the room and said to the tailor, "This is no matter for argument. You, get over here and bow down. You'd better not raise your head until I give the word." Everyone could see that I meant what I said. They begged me to forgive the tailor, but when I said I would, he said, "If you are so sure you can do it, why don't you try some incantations right now?" I purified myself with cold water, ordered the woman to come back, and mumbled some prayers. Sure enough, the woman began to babble just as she'd done before. I finished up, made a boast or two, and left. From that day on, everyone came to me for incantations. I charged less. Sometime later, Tokiyama asked Tonomura if he would recite some incantations using his own younger sister as a medium. He was told, "Your sister is possessed by a living person's spirit. It will take at least 2 or 3 days to exorcise it, and that it will cost 5 ryo. Tokiyama decided to ask me instead. I worked at it for 3 nights running and finally drove the spirit away. Tonomura resented my success and broke off our friendship. I joined forces with Tokiyama and on shadow lotteries alone made 90 ryo. Apart from this, we can easily make 10 or 20 ryo any number of times. I took up religious austerities and penances. I began to going by the Fuji Inari Shrine in Ochiai for 100 nights. I went next to the Inari Shrine in Oji for 100 nights, and after that to the Inari Shrine in Honda for another 100 nights. I also carried out the cold water penance. Squatting half naked in front of the shrine altar, I poured bucket after bucket on myself for 5 or 6 hours at a stretch. That lasted 150 days, and much of it during the winter too. While performing these austerities, I had many interesting experiences, but I won't go into them. Fasting was something else I tried 3 or 4 times, but I was convinced there was nothing I couldn't do. The family of my landlord, Yamaguchi Tetsugoro, had served as district administrators, and the space once used for their office stood empty. I invited Suishinshi Shusei, a swordsman married to a granddaughter of Suishinshi Tenshu, come to use the space to forge swords. I also invited Kichi, a disciple of Honami Yasabudo, to live in my house and work at his profession of polishing blades. I took a few lessons from him. It then seemed like a good idea to form a sword association in which members would pay dues and take turns buying a sword. I invited my fellow swordsmen and friends to join, along with Hosokawa Chikara, Masayoshi, Minobe Taikei Naotane, Kanda no Michiyoshi, Umayama Yasuhachi, Kobayashi Shinpei, and all the other sword appraisers in the business. One day I went to the shogunate prison in Senju and tested my sword on the corpses of criminals who had been executed. After that, I became a student of Asauemon and learned how to lop off the heads of corpses with a single stroke. At home, matters were improving, for my son Rintaro, now 7, was in service at Edo Castle. My lord Yamaguchi Tetsugoro received only a small stipend and was always short of money. He complained to me that he was being hounded by creditors, so I settled his debts for him. He then complained that none of the 9 families living on his property ever paid the house or land rent on time. I threw out the tenants and brought in my friends and acquaintances. The rents now came in regularly, and my landlord went around all smiles saying, "Thank goodness, thank goodness." He told me one day that he was thinking of petitioning the government for an appointment as district administrator. When I advised him against it, he became very angry and sent me a notice of eviction after consulting Hayama Mogasaburo, one of his men. I went to him and explained at length what the position of district administrator involved. "And look," I said, "you're already past 50. You would be better off giving up the idea." "What makes you say that?" "Well, to serve as district administrator, you'll need at least 1,000 ryo to start with. Your rental properties in Edo are bound to fall into disrepair and will take over 200 ryo to fix. Getting your men properly outfitted will take another 100 ryo, and moving expenses, that's assuming you move to your jurisdiction, will come to over 100 ryo. That's almost 2,000 ryo already, and let's say that your bailiff is incompetent and you incur liabilities. No matter how frugal you are, it will take at least 30 years to pay off your debts. Your descendants may well suffer too, because if they don't come up with the money, they'll be banished to some far-off place, or may even have the family line abolished. No, it really isn't the kind of job that someone without ability should seek." The landlord and his family were incensed and demanded I clear out at once. So I went around to collect the rents that were due and pocketed the money. My next concern was to find a place to live. Unfortunately, my chronic beriberi was making it almost impossible to walk. I had a friend look for me and decided on a house on the property of Okano Mogaishiro, a samurai in my unit who lived in Ireicho. I went to Yamaguchi to give formal notice of my move. I said, "If by any chance you'll become district administrator, and I doubt you'll last 5 years even if you do, I advise you be very careful. Of course, my predictions could turn out to be wrong, but in that case, you may count on not seeing me alive." "And what do you mean by that?" I told him what I knew about his retainer, Hayama Magosaburo, and left. Several years later, Yamaguchi was appointed district administrator in Koshu province. A riot broke out in his 4th year of office, just as I expected. He failed miserably at the job. He was recalled to Edo and transferred to the escort guards. He was furthermore 300 ryo in debt and in danger of having his family line abolished. His man Hayama was sentenced to jail for 3 years. Feeling sorry for my former landlord, I went to visit him. "And all this because I didn't listen to you," he said with tears in his eyes. "But if possible, I would like to save my family from being disgraced." I pitied him, so after hearing what Hayama had done, I drew up a draft of a letter to be sent to the district office in Koshu. "Try sending something like this," I told him. "You never know, some generous benefactor might come forward with at least 500 ryo, I should think." Yamaguchi looked nonplussed. He nevertheless sent off a letter immediately, and shortly afterward, 600 ryo were delivered from Koshu. His family was saved from ruin, but his stipend was reduced to 43.5 bales, 13.5 being handed over directly to a rice agent whom he owed 1,500 ryo. Because of all this, his children visit me every month. In the end, Yamaguchi was demoted to the Kobushingumi and put under house arrest for 100 days. But Inoue Gorozaemon, another official involved in the same affair, was stripped of stipend, house, and samurai status. As for Hayama, after serving his sentence, he was banished from Edo. My Beriberi was becoming much better since moving to Okano's land in Idaicho. It must have been a month or so after we had settled that Rintaro, now 9, returned from service at Edo Castle. I decided to send him for reading and writing lessons to a retainer in the employ of Tarao Shichiro Saburo, who lived on the other side of Mitsume Bridge. One morning, on his way to the lessons, Rintaro was bitten in the testicles by a mad dog. Hachigoro, a laborer from Hanamichi, carried him home. Although I was still recuperating at the time, I flew to Hachigoro's house as soon as I received word. Rintaro was propped up against a pile of quilts. I pulled his kimono front and saw that his testicles were intact. Fortunately, a doctor from Narita had already been summoned. When I asked him, "Will my son live?" he sounded rather doubtful. I turned to Rintaro and yelled at him. He seemed to get a hold of himself, so I called him a palanquin for him and took him home. My landlord had sent for a doctor named Shinoda. The doctor began stitching Rintaro's wound, but I noticed his hands were trembling. I bared my sword, plunged my blade into the tatami near Rintaro's pillow, and drawing myself up, glared down at my son and the doctor. Rintaro didn't even whimper, and the doctor managed to finish the stitching the wound. "How does it look?" I asked. The doctor said, "I can't guarantee he'll live through the night." On hearing this, everyone in the house began wailing. I yelled at them to pull themselves together and slapped them soundly. From that night on, I visited the local Konpira shrine. Stripped of my loincloth, I dashed buckets of cold water on my body and prayed for my son. I had Rintaro sleep in my arms and forbade anyone to touch him. I raged and stormed and carried on so that the neighbors were soon shaking their heads, saying, "That sword master who just moved into Okano's place, he's gone out of his mind ever since his son was bitten by a dog." Rintaro's wound finally healed, and on the 70th day he was able to get out of bed. To this day, it hasn't bothered him in the least, so mark my words, it's care and attention that heals the patient. Makino Nagato no Kami, a relative who had been magistrate of Yamada, was newly appointed magistrate of Nagasaki. That same month, the swordsmith Suishinshi Shusei asked me whether I could do anything for Owariya Kamekichi, a man from the Aki domain who lived in Tora no Monotsuto in Sakurada-cho. Owariya made his living supervising porters for traveling daimyo, and was apparently most anxious to act as agent for Makino. I told Shusei I would try. Owariya came to see me presently. He took out 50 ryo and said, "This is to buy a gift for Makino-sama, something to his liking." I purchased several items and sent them over to Makino's son, but someone had beaten us to it and been appointed only the day before. I told Owariya about it and he offered to return the rest of the money. He wouldn't accept. No, that was a fee. It's yours to keep. It was almost 30 ryo left over. Several years later, Kuze was appointed magistrate of Nagasaki. Hoping to do Owariya a good turn, I sent a messenger. He was told Owariya had been dead for some time, and so that was that. My new landlord, Okano Magoichiro, was a rake and a spendthrift. He owed 17 ryo to a tea house in the Yoshiwara, and unable to pay was being threatened with a lawsuit. No one was willing to help him out, though, since this sort of thing happened all the time. He came to see me, and I had just moved in and, in my ignorance, got together some cash for him. Okano got into debt again, having obtained 7 ryo at 5% interest a month to buy a prostitute out of her contract. The trouble was, as security, he handed over the ledger recording the payment of the rice taxes by his fiefs. The retainer at home on his fiefs came to me for advice. I got back the document by putting up security swords and other goods that had been consigned to me. My landlord, however, made no move to help me get my goods back. I eventually retrieved them one by one, but from then on I was always hard-pressed for cash, and with all my social obligations, it was an awful nuisance. For a while I managed to survive by selling what I had left, but soon ran out of goods and was forced to sell my own possessions. I hated parting with them. I'd collected them painstakingly over the years, but what else was I to do? I sold off every single item, and at half the original cost. In the end, I was hard put to fork out 4 pennies. All of this because entirely of my landlord. Okano's wife came to see me secretly one evening. She said, "Mogaichiro's loose behavior is causing difficulties for everyone in the family. Katsu-san, could you talk to his commissioner and get him to order Magoichiro's into retirement?" I went to talk to the commissioner's agent. "We will first need a written statement about Okano's conduct from his wife," he said. I got one from her and presented it to Nagasaka San Uemon, who then discussed the matter with Nagai Goemon and the commissioner of Okano's unit. Soon after, Okano received orders to retire. There was nothing he could do about it, really. Okano's heir, also called Magoichiro, was 14 at the time. I did everything for him, even taking him to Edo Castle for his formal installation as head of the family. His father by then had taken the name Gosetsu and became a lay priest. The Okano family affairs were still a mess, however. I took charge telling the retainers how to go about settling accounts, and succeeded in putting the family finances into shape. Then Gosetsu began acting up again. He hired a man called Iwase Kenuemon, and by devious means obtained from him 20 ryo in cash and a stipend of 22.5 bales of rice. His family once more came to me for help. I brought the matter to the attention of Commissioner Nagai Goemon, and Kenuemon was duly fired and replaced. Young Magoichiro's mother died, and Gosetsu took the opportunity to come up with more schemes. I had to settle these too, and later when he bought a prostitute out of her contract and moved her in, I had to find a separate residence in Yanagashima. A year went by. Gosetsu became seriously ill, and as usual, I took care of him. He called me to his bedside one day. "I don't think I'm going to pull through," he said. "Would you please look after my son? At least don't abandon him until you found him a wife and made sure he has a government post." When I gave him my word, he looked very happy. He died the next day. Again, I had to take over and set things in order. But finding a wife for young Magoichiro was proving to be difficult. The mere mention of the name Okano would put off most parents. I finally had to settle for the daughter of Ito Gonnosuke in Ichibei Cho in Azabu. Magoichiro's mother had said all along that anyone who'd married her son wouldn't need to bring a dowry. I bargained with Gonnosuke anyway and got him to agree to 100 ryo in cash and a set of household furnishings suitable for a family of Okano's rank and station. When this got around, everyone, not the least the peasants of his fiefs, were astounded. "Here we've been paying for 2 or 3 years to find a bride for the young master," they said, "but all we had to do was say, 'Okano,' and people would break off negotiations. Now thanks to you, Katsu-sama, every one of us, not to mention the young master himself, can breathe a sigh of relief. And a dowry too. We are most grateful." The Okano family stipend was 1,500 koku, but for some reason Magoichiro owned not one piece of weaponry. Even to report to his commissioner, he had to borrow a pair of swords at each time. Small wonder that no parent wanted to give him a daughter. His house was in shambles too, so I summoned the peasants on his fiefs in Musashi and Sagami, and over 5 or 6 days persuaded them to put up 400 ryo. I had the house repaired and bought personal effects for the numerous household dependents. I also had a house built on my property for his uncle Senosuke, a lay priest, and procured a concubine for him. The members of the family talked as though I were a god. On top of all this, I had the living expenses provided by his fiefs raised by 200 ryo, and 300 saw to it. From 200 ryo to 300. Saw to it that his men were assured a year's stipend so they could take various lessons, and even obtained a horse for his use. It was, I knew, a bit extravagant for a family with a stipend of 1,500 koku, and an outstanding debt of 5,000 ryo, but since when have fools been known to deny themselves? Meanwhile, I was getting poorer and poorer. With nowhere to run, I decided to throw myself on the mercy of the goddess Myoken and beg her to save me from my poverty. I undertook 100 days' pilgrimage, performing cold water ablutions 3 times a day, eating sparingly, and praying with all my heart. 80 or 90 days went by. While this was happening, it seems that my friends in Shitaya had gotten together and wondered why I hadn't shown up to the neighborhood for such a long time. When they heard from my man Kobayashi that I was down on my luck, they discussed what they could do to repay me for past favors. They hit on the idea of forming a savings association and inviting me to be a non-paying member. But they thought I would refuse if it were put to me that way and decided to ask me to head the association. In any event, Suzuki Shinjiro, a student of Inoue Denbei, came to the house one day. Katsu-san, my friends and I are forming a savings association to go on pleasure trips. Most of the work has been done, and we'd be honored if you would serve as the head. That's very kind of you, but I will have to decline. You see, I can barely make ends meet, let alone join your group. It will fall apart if you don't join. Yes, but I can't even put up the initial payment. That's all right with us. I agreed to join and sent him on his way. Suzuki returned in 2 or 3 days. He set down a big ledger, and placing 5 ryo on the cover, he said, "This is for you, and from now on, whenever any business comes up, a member of the association will come by." Once again, Myoken-sama had answered my prayers. I went back immediately to my sword business. At the end of the month, I made 11 ryo selling a suke kane of Bizen's sword to Matsudaira Hoki no Kami for Matabe, a clerk at the shogunate warehouse. I got an extra 5 ryo from Matabe as a tip. Every night I went to the second-hand goods markets in Kanda and Honjo, and being a pretty sharp bargainer, I soon set aside a tidy sum. Many of the friends I'd helped in times of trouble came to me when they had swords to sell. But since they were not knowledgeable about swords, I never had a loss. At the markets, I made a practice of spending half the profits to treat my fellow dealers to buckwheat noodles and occasionally sake. They addressed me as Lord and Master, and secretly alerted me beforehand if they heard a customer coming with a piece of goods. At the auction market, if I guessed wrong and put up a written bid of 15 silver monmei for something only worth 3 monmei, the auctioneer would take out my slip of paper from under the straw hat and say, "For Katsu-sama, it's 3.5 monmei," and let me off with a loss of only half monmei. To make up for this, though, even if there were as many as 50 people, I treated everyone to buckwheat noodles after the markets closed down. The tradesmen, always ready to bicker over a single penny, so appointed my generosity that they ordered special cushions for me to use at the markets. My friends were envious. "How's it the tradesmen fall all over themselves for you?" they asked. When I told them what I did, they said, "That's no way to make money." But make money I did, and plenty of it. My stipend of 40 bales was 40 bales, and I had debt of over 350 gold ryo. Each time I made a profit, I paid back a small amount, no greater than the cost of a visit to a brothel. And within 2.5 years, my debts had dwindled from 30 or 40 ryo. It was simply amazing. I always put giving to others first, helping neighbors as a matter of course, and those in need according to who they were. Perhaps because of this, even in the leanest years of the Tenpo famine, I had 1/16 of a ryo spending money each day. I also helped tide my friends over, though through hard times. This meant I had to work hard, so I attended the second-hand goods market diligently and thought of it as a regular job. I took a commission of 4% on sales, and in 3 months cleared 3.5 ryo. I ordered a sword for myself. Whenever swordsmen got together, I invariably seated at a place of honor ahead of even the teachers. At the one-year memorial match for Master Fujikara Chikayoshi, attended by over 580 people, I judged the contestants of the competing Minamoto and Taira teams. I also officiated at the memorial match for Master Akaishi Fuyu. This was Master Dano's hall, and at the memorial match for Master Inoue Denbei in the formal opening of the Otani practice hall. Whenever it concerned a dispute between rival schools, disagreements between fellow students, or initiation into secret techniques, I was the one who was usually called in. For that matter, Master Dano made a point of consulting me about initiations at his school. And not one person could ever contested my decisions. Stranger still, all the men in Shitaya and Honjo copied me, my taste in swords, my clothes, even my hairstyle. Back then, rules of etiquette were observed with utmost strictness in the practice halls. It was unheard of, for instance, for a master and student to sit down together in the same room. If a master from another school sent word that he was coming, A top student always went to his home to carry his sword, and teachers were expected to greet the visitor in the front entrance. Nowadays, anything goes. No one pays attention to the rules, and no one seems to mind. Things will change, I suppose. It used to be that only 2 teams were allowed to compete at one time at fencing matches. Even that rule is often disregarded. A certain Chichibuya Sankuro lived in Tori Machi, a purveyor of cloth and sundries to the shogunate. He had lately fallen on hard times. Other merchants had become established as purveyors of the shogunate, and he had little hope of getting any orders. I heard this from my friend Takata Togoro, who went on to say that the youngest daughter of the shogun was about to move to Aki province on the occasion of her betrothal, and that Chichibuya was most anxious to be named official pursuing agent. I persuaded Seiyama-san, a lady-in-waiting at the main keep of the castle, to speak to Kurenai-san, the woman who had been put in charge of the trip. Now, Chichibuya had confided in me that if he were appointed, he would present 30 ryo to Kurenai-san and an equally suitable sum to Seiyama-san. Apparently, the moment Seiyama-san mentioned this to Kurenai-san, the greedy woman had consented eagerly. She issued an appointment to Chichibuya and, for a start, placed an order in the amount of 70 ryo of goods. She also demanded the money. Chichibuya went back on his word, saying how difficult things were and so on, and refused to show his face. I ordered him to come to my house and said that I would have nothing to do with him in the future. Chichibuya, on his part, had already received an official procurement order and was confident that his appointment would not be revoked. Within a day or two it was revoked, the order was cancelled, and Chichibuya was left with a pile of unwanted goods. He came running over with his wife. He gave one apology after another, but I was so put out that I left matters as they were. In the end, Chichibuya lost close to 40 ryo. What's more, his store was raised in a big fire, and from all accounts, he now lives in some obscure back alley. There are plenty like him out in the world. Watch out, or they'll trick you the first chance they get. My second oldest brother, Matsusaka Saburoemon, received an appointment as district administrator. We'd had nothing to do with each other for over 10 years, ever since the big row at Hikoshiro's house over a loan of 8 ryo he refused to pay me. One day, quite unexpectedly, he sent me a letter. Maybe he had a change of heart. It's a shame we haven't seen each other for such a long time, he wrote. Come and visit us if you're in the neighborhood. Enclosed with the letter was half a ryo. Wondering what to do, I went to Kamezawa-cho and talked it over with Hikoshiro's wife. Since he asked, I think you should go, she said. I left immediately for Saburoemon's house in Hayashi-cho. The entire family came out to greet me and treated me to a delicious dinner. There was a great deal to talk about, and by the time I was ready to leave, my brother and I had pretty much made up. A day or so later, Saburoemon's wife sent my wife a note saying how much they enjoyed my visit. I saw Saburoemon frequently after that, and when he learned that he would serve as district administrator in Suibara in Echigo province, the very same job that Hikoshiro had held, I told him what I remembered of the customs of the area, the character of the residents, and the general duties involved. On the 7th day of the first month, when government offices traditionally opened, Saburoemon's oldest son, Chuzo, was slashed by a ruffian who had sneaked into the house during the night. A messenger arrived with the news, and though I ran all the way to Hayashi-cho, Chuzo was already dead. I had an inkling who the murderer might be, so the next day I went around Koshikawa, but the suspect had apparently cleared out. Hikoshiro and other relatives asked me to stay at the house in Hayashi-cho for the time being. I slept there every night and returned home for the morning to attend my business. The investigative officer came on the 25th, and on the 29th, Chuzo's wife, Saburoemon's wife, and Chuzo's oldest son, Juntaro, were summoned to the shogunate court that handled the affairs of retainers. Kurobe Tokasuburo, Saburoemon's third son, and I accompanied them. We went there regularly about twice a month for the rest of the year. Once, while waiting in one of the rooms of the court, I got into a big argument with Kamiue Yataro, a senior policeman in the service of Okusa Notonokami. It took 3 men, the custodian of the court, Kamiyo Toemon, his inspector aide, Ishizaka Seizaburo, a policeman, Yuba Sojuro, to convince them to let off without reporting it to his lord. The altercation lasted about 2 hours and sent everyone into the room into such a dither that it was all I could do to not laugh at their faces. Samurai indeed. This was the year that Saburaemon made his first trip to Echigo. He asked me to look after his affairs in his absence, and I got rid of my debts, took pleasure trips, frittered money away on one foolish thing after another. But I knew enough to not fail into debt again. When Saburaemon returned to Edo, I gave him a full written account. He seemed satisfied. The same year, I adopted the daughter of my cousin Takeuchi Heiuemon and gave her in marriage to Rokugo Chugoro, a student of mine with a stipend of 300 bales. About this time, Takeuchi's son Sanpei was notified that he had received an appointment. Sanpei said he would have to decline since he would not be able to meet the expenses of the office. I scraped up some money for him and saw to it that he reported the next day to Edo Castle. He was told that he had been made a member of the Great Guard. His father was overcome with joy. "Katsu," he said, "I won't forget this favor as long as I live." Years later, though, he didn't think twice about cheating me. Toward the end of the year, Saburaemon was slated to go again with Echigo. He was worried about his son Masanosuke, however, so I suggested that he take his son with him. He agreed. Before their departure, I had a talk in private with Masanosuke about the office in Suibara, what to expect and how to behave, especially since samurai attached to the district offices were able to make money during their tour of duty. He listened enthusiastically and promised to thank me properly when he came back. After Masanosuke and his father had left for Echigo, I remembered that I'd forgotten to tell Masanosuke how I go about measuring the rice for crop taxes. I sent off a letter. It somehow got misplaced and fell into his father's hands. Saburaemon returned to Edo and showed it to Hikoshiro in great indignation. Hikoshiro was furious and ordered me to come at once to Kamezawa-cho. "Whatever made you fill Masanosuke's head with all this vicious nonsense about the district office? You are wickedly and utterly without scruples. And what's this you're wearing? A woolen haori? Tell me, what makes you think you can act so arrogantly?" "I have no memory of writing such a letter," I replied. "As for this woolen haori, I wear it because if I, with my low stipend, went around in shabby clothes, no one would lend me money. I have no choice." "Well, I've heard other things about you, that you spend all your time carousing in the Yoshiwara. Most people your age have given up these things, but you are incorrigible." "I agree you have a point there, but the acquaintances I make there are necessary to my livelihood." My brother became even more furious. "No matter what I say, you talk back. There isn't one relative who talks to me like that. You're the only brazen one. Say another word and I'll cut you down." He grasped the handle of his sword. "Even for you, dear brother," I said, "those are harsh words. May I remind you that I too am an honorable retainer of the shogun. We may differ in rank, but as the saying goes, dogs and hawks do serve the same master. You are mistaken if you think you can cut me down just like that." I took hold of my short sword. At this moment, Hikoshiro's wife intervened. After calming the two of us down, she took me to her room. She said, "Please settle this matter about Masanosuke." I went straight to Saburaemon's house and said to him point blank, "There's not much love lost between us brothers, is there?" "But I was only thinking of your own good when I told Hikoshiro," he insisted. I asked to have his head bailiff, Taroji, come into the room. I told him how Saburaemon had bungled job after job in the past, how he was incapable of managing anything, even his household affairs, and that since he was unfit for his present assignment, the sooner he resigned, the better. Taroji looked puzzled. "Can you explain what you mean by that?" "What I mean is that my brother can't even tell when something's been written by his own brother or not. So how can you expect him to handle important negotiations as a district administrator? Saburaemon reached over for the letter in the official document box and threw it at me angrily. "Look at this and tell me you didn't write it." I picked up the letter and asked for a candle. I read it out loud 3 times and returned it to my brother. "Someone has certainly done a good job of copying my handwriting. So you still refuse to admit that it's yours. That's what I mean when I say you're not very smart. If I had written the letter, do you think I would have read it so smoothly and distinctly? Someone who has to deal with a lot of people would surely know that much. Otherwise, how is he to carry out an important job? I realize that all the relatives look down on me because I haven't received an appointment. Still, have you ever heard of anyone else who, while at the shogunate court, had the courage to stand up against an undeserved insult? Alas, that I should be so unworthy as to have a brother who cannot distinguish true from false. After that speech, the two men were at loss of words. At length, Saburaimon said, I apologize, this must be a forgery. All right then, send a note to Hikoshiro explaining everything. Saburaimon agreed to this, and in a while an answer came from Hikoshiro saying that he was fully satisfied. I got up to leave, but on my way out, I noticed that my nephews had lined up in the adjoining room, their short swords at the ready. Ha ha, I laughed. You should have been prepared like this the day your brother Chuzo was murdered. He might not have been done so so easily. Look at you, all set to attack your uncle. Is there no limit to stupidity? I heard later that the whole family was enraged over what I had said. Both of my older brothers kept a close watch on me. I couldn't care less, and passed my days carousing to my heart's content. Saburaimon's son, Masanosuke, stopped by one day to talk about his father. I had some bills at the brothels, but instead of paying them, I got hold of 6 ryo and invited Masanosuke and one of his father's retainers to the Yoshiwara. Saburaimon made such a fuss when he heard of this that I finally went to see his wife. I cleverly evaded her questions, and the matter was considered closed. Hikoshiro had heard the right, though. For the last 3 or 4 years, I had fallen into dissolute ways and been spending most of my time in the Yoshiwara. So much so that the roughnecks who prowled through the quarters had become my underlings. No one dared defy me. Naturally, this took huge amounts of money, but I was determined not to fall into debt. So I hustled every night at the markets. I just barely stayed ahead. One day in the summer, I was summoned to Hikoshiro's house in Kamizawa-cho. Before leaving, I gave my wife instructions concerning the children and the house. At my brother's house, everyone was in tears. His wife took me to Shintaro's room and said, Kokichi, why do you persist in behaving so recklessly? Your brother has made inquiries about you here and there, and worried that you might be doing something truly dreadful. He's decided to lock you up in a cage. Shintaro and the rest of us tried to talk him out of it, but he wouldn't listen. The cage was finished yesterday. It's in the garden. And your brother was ready to throw you in last night. Shintaro persuaded him not to, but I really don't know what to do. Go look at the cage in any case. I went out to the garden. The cage was sturdily built with double enclosures. I said to Shintaro and my sister-in-law, I appreciate my brother's concern. This time, though, may I suggest that you get some candles to light for me, because I've already made up my mind to stay in the cage for good, and not come out even if I'm forgiven. You see, around where I live in Honjo, I'm well known and regarded as a hero of sorts. The fact is that people who don't know me are looked down upon. But after a humiliation like this, I could never show my face to my fellow men. I will fast and die as soon as possible. Yes, I had a feeling that something like this was going to happen, and before I told my wife what to do just in case. So, Shintaro, here are my swords. I will do as you wish. Ugh. My sister-in-law pleaded with me. Now that the things have come to this, please turn over a new leaf. No, it's too late. I won't change my mind. Shintaro spoke up. I see what you mean, but I still think you should try. What sense would there be if I did? Ever since my father died, I've had no one to turn to, and as for any hope of obtaining office, I've given that up a long time ago. I decided I might as well do what I want and die. Well, I no longer wish to cause my brother trouble, so if I may enter the cage now. I rather thought you would say you'd starve yourself to death, Shintaro said. I tried my best to catch my father in a good mood and talk him out of it, and now look. What matters most is my brother's peace of mind, I assured him. I really think it would be better if I went into the cage. I had an inkling about this for some time, and my friends keep me informed, you know, and I was quite prepared. No, I wasn't surprised one bit. Couldn't you at least go home and talk it over with your wife? That won't be necessary, as I said. I'm not at all worried about my family. Rintaro is 16. He'd be better off if I were dead. If I lived too long, I'd only be a nuisance. But I would be grateful if you would look after him. My sister-in-law insisted that I go home for the time being. I went home and waited. At 8, I had still received no word, so I took off for the Yoshiwara and stayed for the night. Shintaro urged me to write a letter of apology to my brother. He'll have to be appeased one way or another, he said. I couldn't be bothered. Then I heard that my sister-in-law, worried sick, was going from temple to temple asking for prayers on my behalf. I decided to put her mind at rest once and for all. The following spring, I passed on the family headship to Rintaro. I was 37. And I need water. Whew. I'd rather be watching Fooly Cooly. Chapter 6, Life After Retirement. I now had to earn pocket money. I tore around doing favors for people and racked my brain thinking up money-making schemes. At the same time, I was curious to find out what had brought me to this pass. I wondered who had given Hikoshiro the idea of locking me up in a cage. I probed around and became fairly certain that Saburaemon and his family had been behind it, peddling tales to Hikoshiro, even feeding him lies, all in revenge for their humiliation the year before. Well, then I could teach them a lesson too. I was aware that Masanosuke had turned out to be a real good-for-nothing and was causing his father no end of worry and distress. I invited him to my home one day and cajoled him into revealing all he knew about his father's machinations. Afterward, I made sure that he was well supplied with cash, strictly on loan. I next learned that Saburaemon had paid off all his debts to his rice agent in Asakusa. I got a hold of my cousin, Takeuchi, he'd retired recently too, and tricked him into getting a duplicate made of my brother's seal. This done, I sent him with Masanosuke and Suabe Ryuzo to Saburaemon's rice agent to ask for a loan of 175 ryo. Tell him it's to cover unexpected official expenses at my brother's house. The rice agent didn't suspect a thing, especially since the three appeared dressed in kataginu and hakama and bearing a very official-looking box. He handed over the entire sum. I spent it in no time. The deception came to light 2 months later. My brother, a real miser, was extremely angry, but no matter how he ranted, I claimed total ignorance. The rice agent made inquiries on his own, but I was never found out. Suabe Ryuzo dropped by one day. He said there's going to be a 3-dice gambling game the day after tomorrow in Tokugawa. I'd appreciate it if you'd come with me. About 1,000 ryo will be at stake, and if I win, I'll have a lot of money, and I won't feel safe going home alone. Sorry, I'm not interested. I've never gambled and don't intend to. Come along then for the food. You can always take a nap. Suabe had only 13 ryo to gamble with, 10 of which he'd borrowed from me. I said I would go. 50 or 60 men, mostly heads of rice broker shops, and the rich merchants from the Nihonbashi area, had gathered at the tea house. They began gambling, so after I'd had my fill of food, I went to a brothel in Tokiwacho and called for a woman to pass the time. A messenger came back for me around 4 in the morning. Back at the tea house, I saw that Suabe had won about 600 ryo. I persuaded him to quit and walked him home. I remember how amused everyone was when I said it was the first time I'd ever seen such a game. Oh, but isn't the Master Katsu the well-brought-up fellow, they chuckled. The gambling game gave me the idea of lending money to friends and acquaintances at high interest. It was a profitable arrangement, as I soon found out. Some of those I lent money to were women who worked at tea houses in the Okayama section of Asakusa. They took their time paying me back, but I didn't mind, since everyone at Okayama bowed and scraped as if I were the boss of the neighborhood. Among the students in my son's judo class was an older man by the name of Shimada Toranosuke. He was an accomplished swordsman and feared as much for his quick temper as for his skills. I had heard that he had defeated all of the students at the Otani school and recently opened his own school in Shinbori in Asakusa. I decided it was time to meet him. I also knew that he had come up from Kyushu 2 or 3 years ago, and it was my guess that he wasn't too knowledgeable about the ways of the city of Edo. Why not shake him up a bit, I thought. I wore for the visit an underrobe of bright red crepe, a kimono of decidedly rakish design, and over that a short haori. At my side I stuck a wooden sword. Very nice big picture. A student opened the front door of his house and asked who I was. Tell your master the retired Katsu is here. Toranosuke came out at once. He was dressed in a hakama. I was shown to the sitting room, and after we'd exchanged the usual courtesies, I thanked him for his kindness to my son. We chatted about swordsmen, the art of fencing in general. Through all of this, he kept staring at my getup. It also struck me that just to spite me, he was deliberately bringing up the names of well-known idlers and ne'er-do-wells. He was known to have been rather straight-laced, so I let it pass. It was getting close to 4. I said, this being my first visit, I thought I'd bring a present, but I wasn't sure of what you liked, so I'm afraid I've come empty-handed. Do you like sake by any chance? No, I don't drink. What about good food, then? Yes, that I like. In that case, could I trouble you to come with me to Asakusa? He declined, but when I told him I wouldn't take no for an answer, he reluctantly agreed to come. As we walked by the tea houses in Okuyama, I teased and flirted with all the women out in front. Toranosuke trailed behind with open-mouthed amazement. Shall we have some sushi? I asked. He nodded. Come on then, I'll take you somewhere interesting. I led him to the Yoshiwara, but when we were about to go through the main gate, he objected. No thank you, no thank you. I seized him by the arm anyway and dragged him into Okamezushi, an eatery on Nakano-cho, the main street. We went to the second floor and ordered sushi. Tora, do you smoke? A little, but I've given on that now that I'm training. Ha, that's what I call being faint-hearted. Whoever said you can't smoke just because you're training? Listen, I came to visit you today because I heard that you were a really tough guy, but if you're going to be like that, you'll never be able to make your way in this city. Well, if you say so, I'll smoke just today. I called down for someone to buy a pipe and tobacco. Now for some sake, I said. He gave the same excuse, but I made him drink anyway. By now the sun had set, lanterns glowed here and there, and added to the beauty of the cherry blossoms that had just come out. From our second-floor window, I pointed out to Tora the courtesans promenading through the narrow streets. He gazed intently at the scene below and said, It's certainly a world apart. I thought I would give him an idea of my power and influence in the Yoshiwara and took him on a complete tour. I strutted and swaggered, but when I decided that he had been sufficiently odd, I led him to the brothel in Sano Tsuchiya and asked for the best-looking woman in the house. We were told that with the cherry blossoms in the season, the rooms were all booked. But when I let them know who was speaking, a room was opened up straight away. We stayed until morning and parted company at the Morinoshita. Toranosuke must have been really impressed because I heard from Matsuda Kanji, a retainer in the service. It's a picture. Toranosuke must have been really impressed because I heard from Matsuda Kanji, a retainer in the service of Matsudaira Naiki, that he was telling everyone I would have never believed that anyone could get away with that kind of behavior in the Yoshiwara. I wonder how he got so popular. He was also saying, the retired Katsu will come to no harm in the Yoshiwara. Hikoshiro and his family were much relieved to hear this, I was told. So with nothing better to do, I spent my time amusing myself in Asakusa and the Yoshiwara. On Toranosuke's suggestion, I decided to go on a pilgrimage to Katori and Kashima shrines. I asked Matsuda Kanji to come with me. We left early in the 4th month. Traveling through Shimosa province, I took part in fencing matches at practice halls. Many of the teachers had stayed with me at one time or another, so all my expenses were taken care of. At Choshi, my legs started giving me trouble, so I sent Kanji ahead to the places where we were expected and returned to Edo, sleeping comfortably all the way in a big boat. I became interested in Joruri and looked forward each day to my walks in Asakusa and Shitaya, listening to the street-side chanters. In the 6th month, or was it the end of the 5th, Tora's brother Kinjiro came up from Kyushu. I showed him the sights and went back and forth between the two houses looking after him. He was the kind of person who did everything I said, so I usually had him stay with me. One evening, on our way to see a Niwaka dance in the Yoshiwara, I purposely picked a fight at Umamichi. That scared him completely. He claimed to have a reputation in Kyushu as a rowdy, but from what I saw of him, I'd say he was pretty tame. When we left at the end of the 8th month, I saw him off as far as Kawasaki. Young Magoichido, my landlord, was getting over his head in debt, and a while back when I'd found him a wife, I had fixed things up between the cajoling peasants on his fiefs into covering immediate expenses. He had lately taken to drink, however, and become increasingly careless, thinking nothing of inviting common townsmen into his living quarters to tipple with him. His uncle Sennosuke deceived him at every turn and helped himself to household articles to pay for his amusements. Another kinsman, Kudahashi, duped him into lending an enormous amount of money. And now more recently, Mago Ichido had moved into his house, the daughter of a rice shop owner in the neighborhood, and was spending his nights in drunken revelry. His finances were as bad as they had ever been. Sennosuke had suggested to Mago Ichido that he hire someone called Okawa Josuke to see over his accounts. Some men on Mago Ichido's fiefs opposed this, as did his father-in-law Gonosuke. They asked me to block the move, but when I talked to Mago Ichido about it, he became angry and threatened to evict me. I told him off in so many words and made him apologize. Josuke, in the meantime, had slipped 5 ryo to Sennosuke. He was hired as the family overseer. Then, while supposedly setting the household finances in order, he was discovered to have pocketed 30 ryo on the pretext of securing an appointment for his master. The creditors kept coming, but payment was out of the question. Sennosuke talks Josuke into putting up the money. Josuke claimed that total expenses came to 339 ryo, and handing Mago Ichido's a household account book, he kept one copy for himself. He asked for reimbursement. Unable to pay, Mago Ichido decided to cook up an excuse and fire him. Josuke was much too smart for him. Waiting for a night when Mago Ichido was befuddled by drink, he stole his master's account book and burned it. Mago Ichido was in a quandary, for without evidence there was no way to tell whether Josuke had cheated on the figures. No amount of protesting was any use. A month went by. Negotiations with Josuke were at a standstill. Mago Ichido's relatives felt as if it was time to step in. Though they tried various arguments, Josuke insisted that he had to be paid in full. The matter was brought to the attention of Okano Dewa no Kami, the head of the main branch of the family. Okano sent over one of his retainers to bargain with Josuke, but short of evidence, there wasn't much he could do either. Another uncle, Soga Matazaemon, came forth. He too was powerless. The situation remained at an impasse. Josuke took it into his head to present the petition of grievance to the senior counselor Ota Bingo no Kami, and ran up to that official's palanquin as he was traveling to Edo Castle. He was promptly handed over to Mago Ichido with orders from his commissioner, Toyama Akinokami, that he be put under guard. Josuke was locked up in one of the rooms adjoining the outer gate. Extra samurai were hired to watch him, and a number of peasants were called in from nearby fiefs to help out. Once again, Mago Ichido's relatives assembled to confront Josuke. He wouldn't give in, though, for besides being well-read and eloquent, he knew a lot about legal matters and was very confident. Altogether, too much of a match for anyone. Even the men sent down from the commissioner's office had been argued down. As matters were going from bad to worse, Josuke escaped from his room and tried again to petition the senior counselor. Once more, he was turned over to Mago Ichido. Security was strengthened. Then Josuke's wife decided to present a petition of grievance to the senior counselor and duly intercepted. It was placed under guard in a room near the front hall. Amidst this confusion, Mago Ichido's men were running around trying to borrow money to cover the daily upkeep of the growing household. The officials from the commissioner's office were replaced by another pair. They were just as easily done in by Josuke. Why? Everyone laughed. It's as though the men are being sent in to be made fun of. Josuke's wife escaped and was caught a second time trying to petition the senior counselor. Additional guards had to be mounted, and as if this wasn't bad enough, it was learned that Josuke's son, who was in service elsewhere, had also petitioned the senior counselor. He was brought to the house and put in a room near the inner entrance. There were now 3 rooms to guard and even higher expenses. Everyone was at a loss, for there was no prospect of either money or a settlement. The assistant commissioner at Toyama's office had already resigned with pleading illness, and then when one of Toyama's men went to the senior counselor's office to take custody of Josuke's son, he was told, "The senior counselor has been hinting that for someone of his rank and position, your superior, Aki no Kami, is taking an unconscionably long time over what is, after all, a minor affair concerning one retainer of Okano Mago Ichido." Toyama withdrew from his office the next day, And on the pretext of illness, he was succeeded by Honda Hyuga no Kami, another former unit. Honda sent over his own men to talk to Josuke, but they of course made no headway. By now, Magoichido's relatives were getting sick of the whole thing. A friend said to me one day, "Katsu, here you are, living on Magoichido's land, and all you do is sit back and watch this big to-do. Any reason why?" As a matter of fact, yes. All these years, I looked after Magoichido, seeing how he's so incompetent, and made sure that he and his family got enough to eat. When I warned him not to hire Josuke, he threatened to evict me. So I decided to not worry about him anymore, and that goes for his recent trouble too. I passed the time listening to the side street Gidayu chanters. I had retired and was entitled to these modest consultations. Magoichido could go to the devil for all I cared. I purposely stayed away from home and slept every night at Toranosuke's house. I next heard that even the new commissioner was stumped and thinking of demoting Magoichido to the Kobu Shingumi, and leaving it at that. Then, to add to everyone's woes, Josuke's son disappeared. This was very serious, for when someone handed over by the senior counselor absconded, the family responsible was usually tried by the shogunate court, and if worse comes to worse, its name dishonored. Josuke and his family were elated, while Magoichido and his family sank deeper into gloom. Josuke's wife chose this moment to give notice that she had run out of breast milk. On all account of not having been giving 3 meals a day, she said, and delivered her 3 small children to Magoichido. A nursemaid and wet nurse had to be found in a hurry, and with many things happening at once, the new officials in charge threw up their hands and left. In the evening, 2 officials came from the Hyuga no Kami's office with the message that the case be brought to court the next day. All the relatives gathered, but could not agree on any solution. I was at home that day entertaining Toranosuke, but even I had to admit that I had never heard of such a tangle. Josuke took the opportunity to escape once again. He was discovered as he was slipping out of the front gate and quickly surrounded. Swords were drawn, and in the confusion, Josuke's wife eluded the guards. She too was caught, restrained, and brought back to the house tied by a rope. When Josuke had heard what had been done to his wife, he stormed into Magoichido's front hall and demanded, "Since when has it been permitted to tie up a wife of a samurai?" No one knew how to handle him. It was at this juncture that Magoichido's relatives sent a note asking for me to come. I declined, saying I had a guest. They kept sending over messages, however, so I excused myself from Toranosuke and went to see Magoichido and his family. They poured out their woes. "Katsu-san, there must be something you can do." I said, I rather thought it would all turn out like this. If you recall, I was against hiring Josuke from the very beginning, but Magoichido not only wouldn't listen, he got together with his uncle Sennosuke and tried to throw me out. "Oh, I was aware of what was going on," I continued. "No one asked for my opinion, though, so I decided it was none of my business. Well, isn't it a little late to be asking me for help? Besides, I'm not sure I could deal with Josuke. He's a formidable adversary, as you know by now. Sorry, I can't help you." As I stood up to leave, Gonosuke, Magoichido's father-in-law, pleaded with me to reconsider. I said, "Very well, I will negotiate with Josuke, but you'll have to be prepared to reimburse him." "But that's impossible. It would be useless talking to him then." I went home. Toranosuke was waiting for me. "Master Katsu," he said, "I know you've helped a great many people in the past. Now this comes up. Something so big that not even the commissioner and all the relatives can handle it. It's being taken to court tomorrow, and if you'll merely stand by, all the good you've done will have been in vain. Don't you think you should step forward? I've retired and can do without that sort of trouble." "That may be so, but just this once, couldn't you help?" "Why don't you go and talk to them then?" Tora went and came back to tell me that everyone agreed that only I, Katsu Kokichi, could get them out of this disaster. I went over. The relatives entreated me to help them. "We leave everything up to you, Katsu-sama." I promised only to do what I could and went to talk with the officials on duty. "Magoichido and his relatives have asked me to settle this affair," I said. "I have a certain plan in mind. Do you think Hyuga no Kami would have any objections?" "Indeed not," they answered. "If you could dispose of this matter, all of us concerned, not to mention Hyuga no Kami, would be very grateful. Please act as you see fit." I had all the Okano relatives put their signatures to a sheet of paper. From Magoichiro himself, I obtained a set of written statements to the effect that 1. He would allow absolutely no one to interfere with my plan, and 2. He would leave money and any other pertinent business to my discretion. That done, I said to everyone, now that I have agreed to take care of this matter, let me say I have no intention of asking for your advice. There is one thing, though, that I would like to make clear. This mischief by Josuke. This is a very important phone call. BRB. Because wouldn't you know it, I'm barely getting paid to do this, so I gotta take other jobs. Anyways, where was I? There is one thing, though, that I would like to make clear. This mischief by Josuke, if you will pardon my saying so, was entirely your own doing. In the first place, Josuke could not have raised so much money in such short time. He said, had he in fact raised it, Magoichiro's finances would have improved. Instead, they've continued to grow worse. I don't know why Magoichiro has not even a single change of clothes, but in general, it is because Josuke has achieved no results in his job. Personally, I think that Josuke's cheated the accounts by taking advantage of the total lack of supervision, but it was Magoichiro who was responsible for the loss of the account book. What would you like me to do, settle the case by reimbursing Josuke, or settle it without paying him a penny? I will do as you wish. If we take the first course, we will have to pay him in full. Then that's a lot of money. Of the two, which do you prefer? The relatives held a consultation. Let's reimburse him in full and consider the case closed, they said. That would be easier in a way, yet I somehow hesitate to hand over the money that's been obtained dishonestly. Well, how do you propose to settle it without paying him? I can't tell you. Remember, it was because of you were such cowards that Josuke made fools of you. If I told you now what I intend to do, you'll all faint dead anyway. You'll all faint dead away. Everyone looked mystified. I continued. I'll go talk to Josuke while you are still here and convince him that his family should stay in the same room with him. This should make things easier for the guards and give them a good night's rest. Well, for now, why don't you forget your worries and have something to drink? I had some sake brought from my home, and while everyone was drinking, I talked to Josuke and got him to agree to let his family join him. The relatives and the officials thanked me repeatedly and left. Magoichiro and his family were so worn out by the events of the past months that they slept until late the next day. I had another long talk with Josuke and promised him that he would be repaid in full by the 19th day of the 12th month. To see him through till then, I gave him 50 ryo and said I would arrange for him to receive his stipend as usual. We exchanged notes to that effect, and after the negotiations had been concluded without a hitch, I took off the next day for some rest and amusement. In the evening, I went to Magoichiro's house. His family greeted me with smiles and made a big fuss. The money had to be raised, but I knew that as long as I stayed in Eno, I wouldn't get a penny. I'd have to go to Magoichiro's fief in Setsu province. There was also a more pressing business at hand. Magoichiro had spent so much over the Josuke affair that he could scarcely pay his daily help. Even worse, he said, he had anywhere from 30 to 40 mouths to feed and less than a day's worth of rice in the house. I summoned the peasants from his fief nearby. Musashi had told them and told them to put up the money to cover household expenses until the 12th month. They refused at first, but when I explained the situation, they grudgingly consented. I then persuaded Jizaemon, a village headman in the fief, to lend me 40 ryo for my travel expenses to Setsu, and said I'd return it by the end of the year. Earlier in the 17th month, I had submitted a request to my commissioner to become a lay Buddhist priest and change my name. I received permission from Wakisaka Nakatsukasa Shoyu on the 7th day of the 10th month. I took the religious name of Musui, but I shaved my samurai hairdo had not yet grown in. I decided to travel under my samurai name as a retainer of Okano Magoichiro. I asked Toranosuke to tend to my affairs in my absence. On the 9th day of the 11th month, I set off to the Nakasendo Post Road. Accompanying me were Hoto Kisaburo, Iyama Yuhachi, and 2 other men. At the post station in Kugayama, Jizaemon was waiting for me in the with 40 ryo. I was feeling none too well, but I pushed my men to cover as much distance as possible. We arrived at last at the Hakenya in Osaka. We rested for several days and then went to Sonezaki, to the north of the city, to call on a friend, Kagatora. He was fortunately at home, and when I explained to him that the purpose of my trip, he readily agreed to my request for a loan. We arrived the next day at the village of Goganzuka, Magoichiro's fief in Setsu. It was about 6 miles from Osaka. We were put up at the residence of Yamada Shinuamon, the manager of the fief. I lost no time in filling him in on the details of the situation in Edo. In the morning, I called together the villagers and told them the urgent need for money. Shinuemon said, "As you know, the rice yield of the village is assessed at 500 koku, and the villagers already lent over 700 ryo. I doubt if they can put up another penny." I had been told by Magoichiro and his retainers that the amount lent by the village came to 500 ryo and had undertaken the trip on that assumption. This huge discrepancy was a complete surprise. I was extremely annoyed, but said if nothing and dismissed the villagers for the day. If I set my mind to it, I knew there would be a way. I spent the next few days walking around the village. The villagers seemed relatively prosperous, a good sign. I asked Shinuemon how much it cost the villagers to accommodate official visitors. He replied that when even a retainer came on business, he usually came with only 1 man, and daily expenses amounted to 18 silver monme. There were 5 of us. We would have to be very frugal. I told my men to decline all side dishes and take them instead to Shinuemon's mother. Each day I reminded them how important it was to cut down on expenses, now and then I slipped them some money to sneak off to Itami for food and drink. Within several days, looking very pleased, Shinuemon reported that our daily upkeep only came to 10 monme. I refrained from bringing up the subject of money and took trips to Osaka for my own diversion, as well as to gather information on the sly about the villagers. The rumor was that they had no intention of putting up the money, but they're simply waiting for you to get so bored that you'll leave, someone said. To pass the time, every evening I invited Shinuemon and the villagers and their children to hear me tell stories about the exploits of famous generals and brave warriors. They were very much taken and listened absorbed until late at night. One day again, I raised the subject of money. The villagers protested, "But we don't have any money." I dropped the matter. It then came to light that my man, Iyama Yuhachi, had on his own been pressuring the villagers to put up money. Feelings ran high. The angry villagers met day after day for discussions and began milling around our living quarters, waving bamboo spears and shouting abuses. My men were afraid and said they wanted to go back to Edo. I gave them a piece of my mind. The villagers continued to hold their daily meetings, rushing to the local temple at the sound of the bell, and all because of Iyama's stupid demands. I wasn't a bit fazed. Now and then I put on my kimono with the shogunal crest and marched around the village with the retainer in tow. This never failed to send the villagers scurrying. Every morning I had Hotta Kisaburo give readings on the Greater Learning and the Book of Filial Piety, and invited Shinuemon and his family to join us. Shinuemon, a well-meaning and upright soul, appreciated this and offered to negotiate with the villagers on his own. I said no, for I had a plan up my sleeve, something so startling that the villagers would hand over the money even while foaming at the mouth. I bided my time. I came down with scabies and commuted daily to Koyama Hot Springs in Itami, but I set a man to spy on developments in the village. He found out that the village officials were cooking up some various evil plots. I pretended not to know. We had been in Goganzuka for some time. I thought I would pay a visit to Shimoyama Yaoemon, a friend who was in the service of Hori Iga no Kami, the magistrate of Osaka. I had done several favors for him back in Edo and was sure I could count on him. I talked to him in private. He already knew all about Magoichiro and his troubles, and returned to Goganzuka. Shinuemon was curious about my trip. "May I ask who you visited in Osaka?" he asked. Oh, Ige no Kami, the magistrate. We used to take fencing lessons together. You don't say. He looked intimidated. Several days later, a messenger arrived from Osaka with a train of bearers. He delivered an oral communication from the magistrate and presented me with boxes filled with fish and other delicacies. The villagers were struck dumb. Little did we know, Katsu-sama, that you were friends with the Osaka magistrate. They put away their bamboo spears and gave up surrounding our lodgings. It was really funny. I distributed the fish to the village's officials and gave the rest to Shinuemon and his family. It was reported that they all ate the food reverently, bowing their heads and murmuring, a gift, a precious gift from the magistrate himself. They were also apparently chastened and willing to talk about money. I could carry out my scheme any day. One morning, I announced to Shinuemon that I wished to make pilgrimage to Nose Myoken Shrine, and that I would be willing to take with me my man Kisaburo and 2 or 3 of the villagers who had been particularly troublesome. I wore the kimono with the shogunal crest and took along a spear box. I said to the group, "Today I go not as a retainer of Okano Magoichiro, but as a pilgrim." Just before leaving, I said to Shinuemon, "Could you get me a complete set of rainwear?" "Oh, that won't be necessary," he said. "The weather's been fine for the past few days, and I'm sure it won't rain for at least 5 or 6 days." "And let me tell you that I've been devoted to Myoken-sama for many years, and that every time I pray, it pours. Go get some rainwear, will you?" He grudgingly provided a porter to carry the rainwear. We set off, stopping at Ikeda long enough for the porter to go back and fetch a covering from my palanquin. The weather remained clear, and as we climbed uphill toward Mount Nose, we could see in the distance Osaka, Amagasaki, and further down the coastline of Setsu. For winter, it was unusually warm, and even with only 1 layer of clothing, we perspired. Now, no one imagined even for a moment that it would rain. The porter grumbled and complained. I left my palanquin at a tea house at the foot of Mount Nose, and we walked the last stretch to the peak. We purified ourselves with water from the shrine well and climbed the flight of steps leading to the main prayer hall. The other worshippers scattered in all directions when they saw the crest on my kimono and were left to pray undisturbed. We were left to pray undisturbed. We took refreshments in the tea house outside the main gate and began our descent. Halfway down, I saw banks of rain clouds drifting over from Mount Rokko in Arima. "You're in luck," I said to the porter. "Any moment now it'll rain and your load will be lighter." Everyone disagreed. Just because there are rain clouds doesn't mean it's going to rain. "I wouldn't want it to rain before we got to the inn anyway," I said, but urged them nevertheless to hurry. No sooner had we reached the foot of the mountain than it had begun to pour. There was still some distance to the inn. The men were drenched, but I was nice and dry in the palanquin. It stormed through the night and let up only around 4 in the morning. I stayed awake, warming myself at the hearth. You could never tell what the villagers might do, though there was no question they had been impressed. "Katsu-sama," they said, "you are a man truly of strange and wondrous powers. You knew all along it was going to rain. It can only mean one thing, that the gods pay special attention to your prayers. Yes, indeed, the honorable bannermen of the shogun really are different. The likes of us could pray for 100 days and this would never happen." I thought to myself, I've got them now. We made a brief detour to the Tadagongen shrine and arrived back in Ganzuka around 4. That night, Iyama came stealthily to my bedside. He said, "Katsu-san, the whole village is agog about the rain. I have a feeling they've had a change of heart and that you'll be getting the money after all." I was heartened. The next evening, I had Iyama scout the situation again. He reported the villagers divided into 2, those willing to put up the money and those who were not. Leaving Hota Kisaburo in charge, I decided to make another trip to Osaka and left early in the morning. I took in a play at Nipponbashi and another walk with Shimoyama and stayed overnight at the Hakenya. The following day again, a messenger came from the Osaka magistrate with a letter of gifts and food. I had the food cooked and invited Shinuemon and his staff and the village headman. When we had finished eating, I read aloud the letter from the magistrate. Everyone looked subdued. "Now about the money," I began. "We are doing our very best, but so far it's been impossible," they said. I left it at that and went to sleep. In the morning, I called for Shinuemon. "Today I have a special reason for celebrating, and I would like to invite all the village's officials for some sake around 4. Order some particularly tasty dishes from Amagasaki. I'll pay for it. And see to it that the soup and all the other dishes are prepared with extra care. I gave him a copy of the menu I planned and asked to have water heated for a bath. I had Kisaburo fix my hair and bathed while men cleaned up the sitting room. Then, leaving word that we were going to Gozu Tenno Shrine in Itami, I took my men to a kimono shop in Itami called the Shiroi Koya. I ordered 3 sets of ceremonial robes in linen and 2 sets of white haori, and kimono dyed with the Okano family crest. And have them ready by 2 this afternoon. The shopkeeper said he would, as long as he didn't have to dye in the crest. I picked up the goods and told him that someone would be by. I paid for the goods and told him someone would be by to pick them up. On the way back, I gave my men the particulars of the big farce I proposed to put on that evening. We returned to the village sometime past noon. I had Kisaburo arrange a few sprays of white camellias in a vase to place up in the alcove. It was close to 5 by the time we had attended to all the details. The food was ready to be served and the village officials had gathered in Shinuemon's office. I asked everyone to come into the sitting room. As you've no doubt heard, I have a special reason for inviting you here today. It was good of you to come. Now, if you would just make yourselves at home and drink. I poured sake for everyone. And if there's anyone with a hidden talent, please feel free to perform. I started off with a popular ditty I had picked up during my wilder days in the Yoshiwara. I kept replenishing their cups and urged them to relax and forget formalities of rank. Unlike previous meetings at which money had been mentioned, the villagers were in high spirits, laughing and singing and saying the first things that popped into their head. Having satisfied myself that the sake had taken its effect, I ordered tea and rice to conclude the meal. The villagers finished eating, thanked me, and rose to leave. I hurried out to the garden and washed myself with the buckets of water that had been set out according to plan. I quickly changed into one of the white kimono and wore it over the kimono with the shogunal crest. I piled several cushions into the center of the room, flanked them with a pair of candlesticks, and sat down. Kisaburo, I called out, tell Shinuemon and the village officials to come back. I have something important to say. Couldn't we wait until tomorrow? We've all had too much to drink. No, I can't. I have a previous commitment to the Osaka tomorrow and will probably be away for 4 or 5 days. Since you're here anyway, you might as well sober up and listen to this message from your lord and master in Edo. They straggled back to the adjoining room, and when everyone had been seated, Kisaburo threw open the partitions. The villagers bowed low. What I have to say is no less than this, I began. For the past month, all of you have conspired to ignore the repeated request from your lord for funds to settle the Josuke affair. It is inexcusable that you should think only of yourselves and look the other way when your lord makes an appeal. Be that as it may, be informed that I herewith call off all talk of money. The villagers looked grateful and relieved. I went on. I'll have you know that I made this trip expressly at the request of your lord, and great risk to my health. Time and again I appealed to you for help, but you turned a deaf ear, as if I were just another ordinary retainer. It was the height of rudeness. And then, for reasons I fail to understand, you threatened me and my men with bamboo spears. Pray tell me why you did this. Depending on your answer, I may have to take it up with the Osaka magistrate tomorrow and request a hearing. Everyone remained huddled on the floor, speechless. At length, one of them spoke up in tears. We are entirely to blame. Please have pity and forgive us. If you insist, but what are your poor benighted peasants? If you insist, what are you but poor benighted peasants? I turned to Shinuemon. Since they appear to be genuinely sorry, I will forgive them. There is one request, however, that I would like to make to you, and the villagers. You will grant me this, I hope. The villagers said, anything we can possibly do. After all, you were good enough to overlook our offenses. My request is none other than this. As you know by now, the affair in Edo has involved Magoichiro's relatives, the senior counselor Ota Bingo no Kambi, and several other higher government officials. The fact is, it's much more serious than you can imagine. Josuke is bargaining for all he's worth, nothing's been resolved, and the case threatens to be brought to the shogunate court any day. I, Kokichi, could not stand idly by, but try as I might, without money, there was really nothing I could do, and this is why I came to you. I realize the amount Magoichiro wants to borrow is enormous and puts you in a difficult position. It isn't that I don't entirely understand your reasons for refusing. All the same, you would do well to remember the debt you owe your lord from the time of his father, Gosetsu. Indeed, it goes back several generations. Would it be right to forget it? In my opinion, to abandon your lord when his family name and honor are in danger is behavior unworthy of even beast or fowl. Oh, 1 or 2,000 ryo I could have easily borrowed from the Osaka magistrate. But what would be the point then of having been entrusted with the land by Gosetsu? Just think if it were known that Magoichiro had bypassed his own fief and borrowed from another to restore his family fortune. In the first place, it would be most unfilial to his ancestors. Or supposing it were bruited about that he had done this because he couldn't control the peasants of his own land. He would be hard put to revive his family name, much less show his face to his friends and peers. I came to Osaka in the hope that you would come forward, that lord and follower together would put things right and set an example of devotion that no one could criticize. But I, Kokichi, failed to raise the money, and having accomplished nothing, I cannot go back to Edo. In atonement, I have decided to commit harakiri tonight. My request is simply this, that all of you here have to see that my corpse is delivered by the appropriate officials to my son in Edo. Yuhachi will take this letter immediately to Magoichiro. Kisaburo has already agreed to administer the final blow with his sword, and explain everything to my wife and children when he returns to Edo. As for the other two who have accompanied me from Edo, I thank them for all they've done. They may keep whatever money I gave them and leave tomorrow or do as they wish. I have nothing further to say. Ah yes, this kimono from the shogun, I will leave with the village officials. Treat it with respect. I took off my kimono and put it on a large tray, handing Kisaburo my long sword. I said, use this to cut off my head. I ordered one of my men to bring the container in which to place my decapitated head. I'd brought it from Edo, as I unsheathed my dagger and wound its handle with a strip of cloth. I reminded everyone to carry out my instructions. I looked around the room. You may raise your heads now. Behold how Katsukokichi commits harakiri. I held up the dagger. Stop, please stop, crying out, the villagers crawled toward me. Kisaburo, are you ready? He remained bowed to the floor. Must I ask someone else? Kisaburo slowly got up and went behind me. Several villagers clung to him. Please wait, we have something to say. Quickly then, Kisaburo said. Katsu-sama, we'll do whatever you say. Yes, even if we have to sell our possessions. I said, it's too late now. Please, we beg of you not to take your life. Please. They beseeched me, weeping and sobbing. I returned the dagger to its scabbard. Shinuemon tottered forward on his knees in a daze. It is all my fault for not discharging my duties as manager of the fief. Fief? At the very least, please cut off my head and send it to Edo. That won't be necessary. The blame lies with everyone for being selfish and wanting to respect their master. As far as I'm concerned, I've retired and don't ask much of this world. It doesn't matter what happens to me, though I was hoping I might help a lot of people, and that even Josuke might come round once he heard of my death. But since you insist, I will not take my life. Instead, I will ask you to sign a pledge that you will furnish the money. The villagers drew up a note immediately and signed their names. When would you like to have the money? By 10 in the morning. Yes, anything you say. As they shuffled out of the room, Kisaburo spoke to them in a stern voice. Be sure you get the money, because if anything goes wrong, then I'll commit harakiri. The money was collected in a frenzy and presented on a tray the next morning at 10. All of 550 ryo, with the promise to having the money of remaining 50 ryo delivered to the house of Shiyama in Edo before we ourselves had returned. The villagers asked that their contribution to Magoichiro's living expenses be reduced from 330 ryo to 200 for the coming year. I told them that it was out of the question. Would you grant us this request, then? They said. Your man, Iyama Yuhachi, has extorted close to 400 ryo over the past year. We'd appreciate it if you would hand him over to us so that we can hold an inquiry. I said, as soon as the work's done. I could see Yuhachi shaking with fright, so after they left, I told him not to worry. The next order of business was to punish the villagers. I demoted the village officials who had been particularly defiant to the status of plain water-drinking peasants, and replaced them with men who had served in Gosetsu's time. To those who had lent money, I granted the privilege of bearing surnames, and to Shinuemon I gave a set of ceremonial robes, a house, and a plot of land with a yield of almost 1 koku of rice. By evening, all the business had been completed. I told Shinuemon that my men and I would be going to Kyoto for some sightseeing the next day. Send some coolies to head to make sure the necessary arrangements, and have everything we brought from Edo packed and ready. I'll be needing Yuhachi for a while yet, but I'll send him back from Kyoto. I turned to Yuhachi and said, "You're coming with me, do you hear?" That night we were chatting and taking our ease when we were told that two village officials, Uichi and Genuemon, had come with a written petition claiming they had a note from Magoichiro promising to repay 150 ryo by the end of the year. Tell them to extend the deadline to the coming year, I told Shinuemon. I could hear the two protesting in the next room, so I went in to demand to see the petition. Pretending to read it, I held the paper to the candle and burned it. Uichi and Genuemon blanched and muttered something about their breath. "Are you criticizing me?" I shouted. "It has come to my attention that you two have been the worst of the lot. I've tolerated it so far, but this time," they both cringed. "And this note? I'll keep it, thank you." I snatched the document and walked out. With one phrase, I had disposed of a debt of 150 ryo. I thought then how important it was in life to strike at the right moment. We left for Kyoto at 4 a.m. The villagers didn't say a word. We rested up for 3 days at an inn near Sanjo Bridge, and then set off for the Tokaido. During the stop at Oiso, I had my hair trimmed and combed back to fall behind my ears. At Kawasaki, I sent word ahead that we were returning. A crowd was waiting for us in Edo. It was the 9th day of the 12th month. I went straight to Magoichiro's house with the money. The entire family came out and talked as if I were a living god. 2 days later, I summoned Josuke and handed him 339 ryo and obtained a receipt that included the signatures of his relatives, and gave it to Magoichiro. My adoptive grandmother died the next day. I made arrangements for her funeral. The peasants on Magoichiro's fiefs in Musashi and Sagami had said they'd be lucky if I came back with 100 ryo. They were amazed, and as for Magoichiro's relative who'd said he would resign from office, I got as much as 50. Well, I guess I'll put him in his place. I got as much as 50. Well, I guess I put him in his place. My friend Toranosuke was very pleased. Josuke himself couldn't have been happier. "Katsu-sama," he said, "as long as I live, I won't sleep with my toes pointed in your direction." He stops by my house even now. Only a few days remained until the end of the year. I dashed around settling Magoichiro's affairs. His grateful family invited me to dinner, saying, "It's really the first time since Magoichiro's family became family head that we've had such a pleasant year's end." All the people involved in the affair were in awe of me. The truth was, I'd never worked so hard to raise money. The expenses for the trip came to 67 or 68 ryo. I treated my man to palanquins for the trip back, and though Magoichiro offered me the remainder of the money, I declined. I knew that he had barely enough to see him through the year. My friends also said I should take at least 100 ryo, but I had my own reasons for refusing. I finally accepted a bolt of cotton cloth from the Okano family. The mourning period for my grandmother was completed early in the new year. I gave myself up to fun and pleasure as if it were my business, and flitted about from place to place. If I ran short of pocket money, I could always sell swords for people, or come up with one scheme or another. In time, my commissioner got wind of my unauthorized trip to Setsu. He ordered me into domiciliary confinement. It was awfully oppressive, staying home from the 2nd month to the beginning of the 9th, but at least I talked Magoichiro into giving me a monthly allowance of 1.5 ryo and a bale of half rice during the duration of my confinement. I consoled myself pottering about in the garden. Early in the 9th month, a friend went to see the commissioner and explained that my trip to Setsu had not been for pleasure, but to help out Magoichiro. The commissioner said, "Katsu went out of necessity, you say. He still shouldn't have crossed a barrier station without permission, but since he seems to be behaving, he ordered me released from house arrest. After being cooped up for so long, it certainly felt good to God about again." I had a 2nd floor built onto the house, and having become interested in the tea ceremony, I added a small tea room. With my cousin Takeuchi, I browsed through the shops for tea utensils. But greed hath no limits, as they say, and the more and more I saw, the more I wanted. I ran out of money and borrowed from the brothels in the area at agreed-upon rates. I collected 26 ryo in 3 days and promptly spent it all on tea utensils. I could think of nothing else whenever I was short of cash, I went to the brothels. In all, I must have borrowed 70 or 80 ryo. I now got about 20 of the men who hung about the retainer's quarters in Magoichiro's house to work for me for free. I had them patrol the brothels in the vicinity and dispatched a man whenever a customer got out of hand. In return, the proprietors sent over gifts of cash on the 5 major feast days of the year. At year's end and at the Midsummer Bon Festival, too, I received 1/2 ryo from each brothel, a total of 7.5 ryo. 4 other establishments sent over 2 ryo every year. So that all told, I must have made 50 or 60 ryo a year. My men, moreover, were given 1/2 ryo or so each time they went to the rescue of a tea house owner who sent for help. For that matter, it had gotten so that anyone who wanted to set up shop or conduct business in the area felt obliged to send me gift money. It was all very simple. I was the boss of the entire neighborhood. I spent money as though it bubbled right out of the ground. The following year, in the 2nd month, I started feeling poorly. I became gravely ill. I went through several treatments and was set up about by the end of the 8th month. But I ran around recklessly too soon and was seriously ill again early in the 12th month. My body was swollen all over. It hurt even to turn over in bed. The commissioner must have heard about my high-handed ways. On the 22nd day of the 12th month, he ordered me into the domiciliary confinement at the Toranomon residence of Hoshina Eijiro, a samurai under the same commissioner as my son. Too weak to walk, I had to go by palanquin. It was only the summer after that that I had finally recovered. I tried to retrieve money and items that I had lent to various people in my Honjo neighborhood. The total owed to me came out to about 40 ryo, but no one paid up. I had gone to Hoshina's place at a minute's notice and could never bother to make any provisions. There was little I could do, and besides, I had nobody but myself to blame for this poverty. Chapter 7. Some other incidents. It was before I retired, thinking it would be a good idea to donate a sacred mirror to the Myokin shrine in Kita Warigesui. I talked to the members of the shrine association. We decided to raise 12 ryo. Among the daily visitors to the shrine was a fine-looking samurai by the name of Nakamura Tachu, who said he was an official in charge of finances for the daimyo of Wakayama. When we told him of our plan to donate a mirror, he said, "Most admirable. Allow me to be a sponsor too." He promised to donate 3 ryo. The rest of us were delighted and fluttered around him saying, "Tachu-sama, we are so beholden to you." The money was raised, and though I was asked to hold on to it, I was unwilling, and it was handed over to Tachu for safekeeping. That night he disappeared, money and all. We searched everywhere but couldn't find a clue. I mentioned the incident to Takeuchi Heiuemon one day. "That fellow Tachu," he said with a laugh, "is what is known as a confidence man." "And what is that?" "Well, a confidence man ordinarily dresses in fine clothes and goes about visiting places like shrines and temples and lecture halls where pilgrims are bound to congregate. He wants to impress people, so he pretends to be very devout. He also lets it be known that he handles money for temples and monasteries and the like. Before you know it, he's duped people into giving him money, fees for arranging loans, for instance. Then he moves out of his lodging and goes elsewhere to practice his tricks. It's a regular year-round business, you know," he continued. 10 or 20 of them work as a group. They bribe the local policeman and his assistants, and they're all set. If one of their men gets caught and things get sticky, they band together and bail him out one way or another. Yes, your so-called friend Tachi was a confidence man, all right. Some of them even work on highways and fob off quack medicine and such stuff to unsuspecting country folk. But those I'd call second-class confidence men. A similar incident took place when I was living on Okano's property. 7 or 8 bannermen of my acquaintance in Honjo had heard that the Zojoji temple in Shiba lent out money. In the eagerness to borrow funds, they were tricked into handing over money to a man who said he'd arrange for a loan. As a result, one of my friends, Hasegawa Kanjiro, was left in considerable financial distress. I had heard enough from Takeuchi to know that this was all part of a confidence game, so I got a hold of the culprit, his name was Ishikawa Goro, and made him return the money. Another friend, Katsuya Yogen, was also talked into paying a fee for a loan by a certain Fujisawa Jizaemon. He had no idea where Fujisawa lived, but I tracked him down and recovered the money. My friend Hasegawa Kanjiro was swindled yet a second time. He met a man called Saito Kanbutsu to discuss the matter of a loan. Saito came to see him several days later, and Hasegawa, anxious for a loan, plied him with food and drink. In the course of the visit, Saito brought out a nugget of silver. Hasegawa was quickly taken by it and went around the house showing it to his family. He returned to the sitting room, placed the nugget beside him, and resumed his drinking. When the time came to leave, Saito asked for the nugget. The two searched the room but could not find it. Saito left only after Hasegawa had promised to look for it more carefully. Hasegawa looked all over the house, but it was nowhere to be seen. Saito returned in a few days. He said, "I really should tell you that silver nugget I brought the other day was discovered in a mine in the Wakayama domain. It's already been shown to the daimyo. I was just holding it temporarily. It would be terrible if it were lost." He fooled Hasegawa into giving him 5 ryo and told him, moreover, they couldn't possibly arrange any loans. Hasegawa and his family were left in sorry plight. Imai Sanjiro of Hayashi-cho was a good friend I had taken writing lessons with. He was also tricked by Saito. In his case, he'd been told that he would get a loan from Koyasan, the temple in Wakayama, and had handed over to Saito 1.5 ryo as an advanced gift for an agent of the temple office in Edo. He never laid eyes on Saito again. Imai told me the story after I had told him how Hasegawa had been duped. "It's the same man, all right," he exclaimed. "Do you know where this Saito lives?" "In the compound of the Nichionin temple in Asakusa. I'll get the money back for you." "I doubt if you can. I've already had a policeman look into it." "Just wait and see. I'll get the money." We left it at that. Several days later, I went to Saito's lodgings in Asakusa. An attendant ushered me into the sitting room. I could tell at a glance that Saito lived in grand style. On the floor was a bearskin rug the size of 3 tatami mats, and against the wall an imposing Shinto shrine. A rack held a pair of swords with scabbards wrought in gold, and further off in the corner was a stack of wicker hampers and containers for traveling. Saito walked in, fingering a rosary of crystal and amber with a sanctimonious air. He had on a hakama and padded haori of silk black crepe. I introduced myself, and after we'd talked about devotions and prayers and so on, I mentioned that Nakamura Tachu and I were good friends. I said with a straight face, "He told me about you some time ago, and I've been meaning to call, but you know, with this and that." Saito turned red and quickly whispered something into the attendant's ears. Minutes later, the attendant returned with a tray laden with food and sake. Taking only a sip now and then, I brought up the subject of confidence men. "I always used to ask Tachu to do favors for me, but come to think of it, I haven't seen him since that big flap about the mirror for the Myoken shrine. I believe he's in Shimsoa now." "So that's it. Well, judging from the splendid furnishings of your house, I'd say you haven't done too badly for yourself. What's your line of work, by the way?" Saito admitted at last he was a confidence man. "And Katsu-san, if I could be of some use to you." I leapt at the chance to remind him about Imai, got the money, and left. Imai was very grateful, I said to him. "You got to deal with these men on their own level. Money's their business, and if you're open with them, they'll be open with you." In a day or so, Saito came to see me with an attendant carrying gifts. I had him do some work for me, and as a result, I got to know quite a bit about the crooked ways of the world. I told Hasegawa one day all about Saito and his confidence game. He looked very alarmed. But if samurai insist on walking around with their noses stuck up in the air, they'll never learn what's in this world. It was when I was living on Yamaguchi's property. I became hopelessly smitten with a certain woman. In desperation, I told my wife about it. "Leave everything to me," she said. "I'll get her for you." "Oh, would you? But you first must give me some time off." "Whatever for?" "I intend to go to the woman's house and persuade her family one way or another to give her to you. You say they're samurai too, so they could do very well to put me off. Don't worry, I'll get her for you even if I have to kill myself." I handed my wife a dagger. She said, "I'll go tonight and bring her back without fail." I took off for the day looking for something to do, and ran into Tonomura Nanpei. As we stood chatting, he said to me, "Katsu-san, I bet you're the prone to woman of trouble. I can tell by the features on your face. Can you think of any particular problem in that nature?" I told him about the conversation I'd had with my wife earlier on. How very commendable of her, he said, and went on his way. I decided to drop by to see if my friend Sekikawa Sanuki, a fortune teller. He took one look at me and said, "Something dreadful's about to happen. Come in and we'll talk about it." Inside, Sanuki went on to say that he could see right away that I was having woman trouble, and this very night I foresee trouble over a sword. A lot of people may be hurt. Tell me, can you think of anything along these lines? I told him about my infatuation with a woman and my wife's determination to get her for me. He was speechless at first, but then started to give me counsels, saying how fortunate I was to have such a devoted wife, and how I should take better care of her in the future. I thought about it for a moment. He was right. I was clearly in the wrong. I flew home. My wife was just about to leave. She had sent her grandmother with our baby daughter to Hikoshiro's in Kamezawa-cho, and had finished writing me a note. It took a lot of talking to convince her to give up the idea, but the incident ended without mishap. It wasn't the first time she'd got me out of trouble. After that, I tried to be more gentle and considerate to my wife. Until then, not a day had passed without my hitting her for one reason or another. Until then, not a day had passed without my hitting her for one reason or another? Maybe it's because of these past beatings, but she's suddenly become sickly over the last 4 or 5 years. I know what. From now on, I'll treat her like the retired lady of the house. A year before my retirement, a great fire had ravaged the Yoshiwara, and many of the pleasure houses had been forced to move to temporary quarters. One day at the Sano Tsuchiya, it had been relocated to Yama no Yado. I got into a big fight with Kuma, the son of an employee at the copper mint in Hashiba. We were on the second floor, so I picked up Kuma and threw him down the stairs. He had to be carried home by some men who were running from the mint. In a while, about 30 men appeared with hooked spears. They began surrounding the house. I flung off in my outer garments, hitched up by the hem of my kimono, and rushed outside swinging my sword. I forced the men to retreat 200 or 300 yards, but just then a band of men arrived from the local patrol office to break up the fight. After this, even the crones and shrews who were hired to escort customers to the brothels drew away as soon as they saw me. The brothels in Yama no Yado closed shop for 3 days, and the incident ended quietly. I was also in a great many other fights, but I've forgotten most of them. The sword I used at the time in Yama no Yado was 2 feet 4 inches. In another fight, I'd gone with Taro Shichiro Saburo, Otani Chujiro, and several others to Asakusa Fair. I had with me this sword made by Seki no Kane. It was 2 feet 7 inches long and had a leather loop at the tip of the scabbard. Tarao had asked me at the last minute if I had no time to put on my hakama. In the crush of people going through the Kami Narimon gate, my sword got caught in the folds of my kimono. Unable to move my legs, I was carried forward willy-nilly by the crowd. Out of the blue, a man hit Tarao on the head with a big wooden pestle. A samurai, no less. Even while jostled by the crowd, I tried to hold the fellow back by his haori, but he hit me on the shoulder with the pestle. Then, when I tried to draw my sword, the tip of the scabbard got caught. "Just wait, I'll cut you to pieces," I roared. The people around me shied away, so I whipped out my sword and struck at the samurai. The blade grazed his back in a straight line, slashing his obi and making his pouch and pair of swords fall out. He ran off without stopping to pick up his belongings. A man from the guard station at Denboin came out with a long stick. I waved my sword in his face a couple of times and sent the passerby flying. I scooped up the swords and pouch and threw them into the guard station. My friends and I headed immediately for Okuyama. I had to admit that in a crowd, a long sword had its drawbacks. The blade must have barely skimmed the samurai. Tarao got a nasty cut on his right bald head, too. We picked fights along the way and went as far as Ryogoku Bridge. That evening, with nothing special to do, I went home. There were scores of adventures, but they took place so long ago that I've all but forgotten on them. Final chapter. Reflections on my life. 2 pages. Although I indulged in every manner of folly and nonsense in my lifetime, heaven seems to have not punished me yet. Here I am, 42, sound of health, without a scratch on my body. Some of my friends were beaten to death. Others vanished without a trace or suffered one fate or another. I must have been born under a lucky star, the way I did whatever I pleased. No other samurai with such low stipend money as I did, and how I blustered and swaggered about with a trail of followers at my beck and call. I wore kimonos of imported silk and fine fabrics that are beyond reach of most people. I ate my fill of good food, and all my life I bought as many prostitutes as I liked. I lived fully. Only recently have I come to my senses and begun to act more like a human being. When I think of my past, my hair stands on end. He who would call himself a man would do well to not imitate my ways. Any grandchildren or great-grandchildren that I may have, let them read carefully what I have set down and take it as a warning. Even putting these words on my paper fills me with shame. I have no learning to speak of, having taught myself to write only in my 20s, and barely enough to cover my own needs at that. My friends were all bad and none good. Unable to distinguish right from wrong, I took my excesses as the behavior of heroes and brave men. In everything, I was misguided, and I will never know how much anguish I caused my relatives, parents, wife, and children. Even more reprehensible, I behaved most disloyally to my lord and the master shogun, and with uttermost defiance to my superiors. Thus did I finally bring myself to this low estate. I am most fortunate in having a filial and obedient son. My daughters, too, are very devoted. My wife has never gone against my wishes, although I am altogether satisfied to have lived up until now without any serious mishap. At 42, I have understood for the first time what it means to follow in the path of righteousness, to serve one's lord and one's father, to live with one's kinsmen in harmony, and to have compassion for and love for one's children, wife, and servants. My past conduct truly fills me with horror. Let my children, their children, and their children's children read this record carefully and savor its meaning. So be it. 1843. The remainder of the book is notes to translation, and Katsukokichi was a very bad man. I don't like that guy. He was not a very good man, and he knew it, but he didn't. I hope you enjoyed. That's the end of this stream. I got a coffee page if you want to help support me. I got a YouTube channel that's getting published onto. Sometimes I stream other things. Okay, thanks. Bye.